All right, it looks like we're live. So, Gil, thanks for coming on and taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a
Mhm.
little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. So my name is Gil Sanders. I am a graduate of Cal State LA. Got my bachelor's degrees in philosophy. Um, I was taught under Edward Fazer, who I regard as one of the best philosophers of this age. Um, and let's see, I started philosophy when I was about 12, actually. Coming from a home in which different ideas were being put forth. I was a Christian, mom wasn't a Christian, and I kind of just had questions, who was right? And I just came across like these forums, and one of them was actually teenspot.com at the time. And we just got into debates, and I just really enjoyed those debates, and I wanted to pursue that more and understand how the world works and what's truth. So that's a bit of my story. Just to summarize it out. So, and I'm a Thomist, just in case you guys don't know. So that just means I follow Thomas Aquinas. I kind of, I've been trained by Edward Fazer, studied under him for about 2.5 to 3 years at Pasadena City College. So that was a really great privilege. I learned a lot from him. I really think the Thomistic system is a beautiful system of thought. I think it coheres really well together, and I think it corrects a lot of modern errors that we see today. So,
All right, cool. So,
yeah.
I'm an
Mm-hmm.
atheist, by which I mean I don't believe there's any reason to believe in a God. So, could you tell me more about
Mm-hmm.
Thomism and why you think that is good reason to believe in a God?
Okay. Yeah, so hope you don't mind, but I'll probably take about like maybe 10, 15 minutes to explain an argument here because, Thomism has a lot of metaphysical kind of terminology to introduce. So I'm really just going to have to introduce that to you guys. So one of
No
the
problem.
arguments
Go
that I'm
ahead.
going to, okay, great. All right, so one of the arguments I'm going to use today is known as Aquinas' first way. It can be traced back to Aristotle. It's basically an argument from change. So it argues from change to the existence of God. The thing that's unique about this argument is that it doesn't assume the beginning of a universe. In fact, it actually assumes that it's eternal. So that so from there, it makes it a little distinct from all the other arguments, like Kalam cosmological argument, and that I really like it for this reason. So let me just go ahead and present a more a little bit modernized formulation of the argument. So I'll be presenting each premise to its conclusion, and then I'll be defending each one of those premises. All right, so the first premise in the argument from change is that some things change. That's premise one. And now the second premise is everything that is changing is being changed by something else. Nothing can change itself. And the third premise is that, but this series of changes cannot go on to infinity. And then the conclusion, therefore, there must be a first cause of all change. And so I would like to start then with the first premise. Some things change. Now, I think this is pretty self-evident. I'm moving my hand, there's a change in location. Things die, they go out of existence. That's a change in substance. Things come into existence, that's also a change in substance. There's also changes in qualities, like, for example, water freezing, water melting. Those are changes in qualities. There are also changes in different like colors, that we see and the seasonal changes. So changes seems to happen all around us. In fact, it just simply seems to be an undeniable fact of reality. And so from this, I think that most people, it's pretty certain evident that our senses show us that change is real, that change actually exists, except for Parmenides and Zeno. So these two are pretty influential kind of characters, in at least in the ancient philosophy period. So their idea, Parmenides especially, is like, well, change is impossible. And his argument for that is he starts off by saying, well, there are only two ways in which we can describe the world. We can describe how the world actually is, its being, and then we can describe the way it's not, its non-being. So let's take, for example, a rubber ball. That rubber ball is actually red, it's actually round, it's actually made of rubber. But there are things that it's not. So it's not orange, it's not pink, it's not a puddle of goo. So those are things that it's not. So for Parmenides, he says, how do we account for change? Change goes from being a red ball to being something that does not yet exist, which is the orange ball. So that orangeness somehow comes into existence. That orangeness comes from is from not being. That something can come from nothing. And he says that that's impossible because nothing has no power to give or cause anything and to bring anything into existence. So this was Parmenides' big challenge in the day, and he thought basically this proved that change is an illusion. But Aristotle, like most of us, I think, wants to say, no, this is obviously false. We see change every day. We experience change every day. So there must be something wrong with this argument. And so Aristotle wasn't simply content by saying, oh, we experience change, therefore Parmenides must be false. We have to address Parmenides' argument because he's presenting a rational critique of our experiences. And so Aristotle's response is to say that no, Parmenides is actually giving a false dilemma. He says there's only two types of being. One being, which is how a thing actually is. It's actuality. It's actually rubber. It's actually red. It's actually round. And then the way things it is not. Now, for Aristotle, he introduces this concept. Well, that ignores as a middle ground between being and non-being, and that's potency. Those are potentials. There are potentials in a thing itself that it has, so that it makes it not such that it's going from being to non-being, but it's going from one type of being to another type of being. So for Aristotle, we see, for example, take that rubber ball example again. It has the actual potential, real potential, to be orange. It's a real potential. It's not a non-existent potential. So it's not non-being, but it's not actuality either. It's not being in a sense that it isn't here and actualized here and now. So that seems to refute Parmenides' claim. At least it does a good amount of it, because in order for change to occur, there has to be potencies. There has to be potentials in the thing itself. Then there's also a second precondition of change, basically. So in order for something to change, there has to be something actual to change it. So Aristotle and Aquinas would both say that, well, what is change? What is change by its very nature? So change is ultimately just the actualization of potential. It's something making something actual. So, for example, that rubber ball, its potential to melt into a puddle of goo, is actualized by a very hot object, say like fire. That actualizes the potential in the ball to melt. So this leads us quite naturally then to the second premise, which states that whatever is changing is being changed by something else. Nothing can change itself. So we can see this pretty evident because, for example, potencies, potentials, they have no power to actualize themselves. Potentials depend on actuality to exist. So, for example, a rubber ball has a potential to bounce, has a potential to become orange, has a potential to melt into a puddle of goo, but it does not have the potential, say, to turn into a zebra. There are certain potentials it does not have. So actuality is limiting its potentials. So in order then for that potential to be actualized, it has to be actualized by something that is already actual, like fire, something that already has heat to confer to the ball in order for it to melt. So, and if something were to bring itself into existence, if potencies could bring itself into existence, we should see it all the time. There would not be nothing stopping the potential from actualizing itself. So it just seems absurd then to propose that potentials are actualizing themselves. So we have to say then that whatever is changing is being changed by something actual, something that already has the power to actualize it. So that leads us then to the third premise, but a series of changers cannot go on to infinity. So you have the ball being melted by fire, and then you have the fire itself undergoing change because it's moving, it's having different qualities at every single moment of its existence. And that's explained by, say, the chemical structure of that fire, but that chemical structure itself being changed by, say, an atomic structure. That atomic structure is undergoing change as well. And then we go into the quantum world, where it's also undergoing certain changes in position or changes in state vectors, whatever have you. It's all going through some kind of change. So we're going through these series of changers, but this cannot go on for infinity. And I think an apt analogy that Aquinas gives is his stick analogy. So you have a stick, and that stick is moving a rock, and then that stick is moving a book, and whatever else you want to add to that series. That stick, those items that's being moved, they're only moving insofar as I'm moving them. So if I stop moving these items, they cease movement and altogether. So there has to be a prime mover, some mover that just has to have has the power to change other things without itself being changed. Because then if it's changing and in the process of changing other things, then you have to explain why that thing is changing too. So you have to have some kind of ultimate explanation. Otherwise, there wouldn't be change possible in the first place. We wouldn't observe any change. So I think that this leads us then to the conclusion, which is therefore, the first cause of all change, there must be a first cause of all change. And I would argue that that actually is pure actuality. Because at every moment of these things that we're seeing that these objects have a mixture of actuality and potentiality. But since they're all being moved and changed, so that actuality, for example, the fire has to be moved somehow. It's being moved by the chemical structures. It's moving only insofar that this chemical structures is moving it. And that chemical structure is only being moved insofar as the atomic structure is being moved. So that's something that simply does not have the potential to be changed in itself, so that it can account for why change is possible. And so you might wonder then, why do we call this being God? How does this even get to God? And I think that it actually follows quite nicely from the notion of what it means to be a purely actual being. So what it means to be purely actual, to find that more clearly here, it simply means to have no potentials in its being. It has no potentials to change in its essence and what it is. And so that obviously then entails that, if it has no potential, then it's pure being. It's being in the most general sense. It's lacking in nothing in its being. And so if it's lacking in nothing and has no potentials, it cannot by definition be a material thing, because material things by definition always have some active potency mixed into it. It can change. Every material object, it can either change in a state vector, it can change in some state, it can change in its quantities, it can change in its location, it can change in its movement. It can always undergo certain change, and the only reason it can undergo those changes is because it's a material thing that has potency in it, has potential in it, and that potential has to be actualized by something else. So it can't be a material thing, it has to be something immaterial. Not only that, but if it's immaterial, and then it can't also likewise change, because for the reasons I said before, change requires a potential. And so this being is purely actual, so therefore it's eternal in a very important sense. In the sense that he's completely outside of time. God is not being changed. This purely actual being is not being changed in some way, even though it can cause change in other things. Leads us also to the idea that this being is all powerful, because in order to actualize other things, it can't be decreasing or increasing in its power. So when I'm like going to the gym and lifting weights, after a while, I'm losing my strength. I'm losing power after a while once I'm exerting it, And so I think too, when this purely actual being is creating, it cannot be such that it is losing its power. It's losing its actuality or gaining in any actuality. So it has to be in some sense all powerful in order to actualize anything. And that also then leads us to, I think, since it's immaterial, since it's eternal, since it's all powerful, I think also it naturally leads us to the belief that it's an intellect, it's a mind, because there are only two possible candidates for what any material thing could be. It could either be an abstract object or it could be a mind. And as we know, abstract objects have no causal power. And number one cannot cause anything to exist. Triangularity cannot cause anything to exist. These are simply abstract objects. They have no power in themselves. But a mind, at least it's a possible candidate, even if you don't want to say that you think the mind is an actual physical brain, but at least it seems to be a plausible candidate for some immaterial thing, at least in theory. And so it seems then that we only left with the only other conclusion, which is the most plausible one, is that God must be a mind. He must have a mind to understand, a mind to grasp things. And from there, we can also say, from, like Aquinas says, from the intellect follows the will. So it must also have a will. It can't simply just have a mind that's necessitated to do or think in a certain way. Because if it was necessitated to create the universe, for example, if it had to create the universe, it would have to be actualized. It would be in its nature such that this God has to create the universe in order to actualize itself in God's being. But since God has no potentials in his being, he has something to actualize in himself, he doesn't need to create anything. Because if he does need to create something, then this being can't be purely actual. It can't be the first cause of all change. So I would say then that leads us then that God has some kind of freedom in the creation of the world. Since the world did not have to exist, there has to be some being that's such that it's capable of choosing or choosing not to create this being, this world. So then also lastly, then this leads us to that there can only be one purely actual being in principle. It's not simply that there could be purely actual beings in principle. Like there can only be one. And the reason for that is that you'd have to differentiate between two purely act beings. So if you have a pure act being A and a pure act being B, how would you differentiate them? You can't use matter. Matter differentiates it in terms of matter's located here, it's located in here. So we have two different objects that have maybe the same essence in some way, like two pencils. They may be identical in every single way, but they're individuated or they're differentiated in terms of their matter. But this being, as we know, just simply does not have matter. Nor can we say it's a difference in metaphysical properties that this has, like say this A has a metaphysical property that B does not have. Because then you're saying that this being A, pure actuality, has more purely actual in its being than B. And it's impossible for that to happen because it's supposed to be purely actual. There's no aspect of its being in which it's limited. So the only reason we have diversity and multiplicity of beings is because there is a difference in what they have or what they lack. And since pure actuality, if we have two pure actual beings, they're just pure, they don't have any of those lack. They completely have being in its fullness. That's what it means to be purely actual. So we can't differentiate them in principle. So it's kind of like saying, for example, if I had, say, a concept like bachelor, what is a bachelor? We know that's an unmarried male. And then I had a concept, another word called schlob. What would differentiate this two in terms of what they mean? Besides, of course, they're the words that we use. And well, the schlob, if I define schlob as an unmarried male as well, they're pretty much identical in their concepts. They're the same word in essence, Or when I talk about, we talk about morning star or evening star. Now, these things may differ in terms of their sense. That's, the classical Russell, as other philosophers have pointed out, is that they differ in sense that we're talking about the star that seems to appear in the morning and then the star that appears at night. But they're both the same. They both refer to actually the same object, so they have the same reference. So in the same sense, though, in the same way, it seems that there is no way to then, in principle, differentiate it, at least two purely actual beings, in terms of its ontology. There's nothing to differentiate. We may be able to differentiate in terms of like sense. You may try to use some different words to describe it. At the end of the day, it's still just going to be purely actual, and there can only be one being in principle that follows from this. So I believe that this is what we all know to be God, and I'll let you state your objections.
All right, cool. Well, the first thing I wanted to start with was actually something that doesn't have to do with Thomism. It was when you said that something that's timeless and spaceless must either be abstract or a mind. That is a argument from ignorance, don't you think?
I think in terms of argument for ignorance, I would say in terms of it's at least plot, because we're trying to say what are the most plausible possible candidates that we have. I'm not saying necessarily, I don't have to say anyways, that this exhausts the possibilities necessarily. But I simply have to say, well, this is what we know to be possible. And so among those things that we do know, this seems to be the most plausible explanation. Now we get into a more advanced Thomistic argument. I know I'm borrowing from Leland and Craig, so this is typically not the way a Thomist would argue, in fact.
Right.
In terms of arguing for the intellect of God. In fact, we would probably argue more in terms of like the fifth way, argues in terms of teleology, final causes. So in terms of final causes, things pointing toward a certain end, that implies that there has to be an intellect. I just didn't want to do that because we'd have to introduce a lot of more terminology and then have to even go into the fifth way to demonstrate that. But I think this suffices to show that this is plausible, and the most plausible way to think how to think of this being.
Right. So my objection to that would be we do actually know of natural things that can exist outside of space and time that aren't abstract objects and minds. Neither of those can actually exist outside of space or time, given philosophy. So like in the amplituhedron, which is a theory by Nima Arkani-Hammad in physics, that's where space and time emerge from a more fundamental natural thing, which is called the amplituhedron. And Sean Carroll poses a theory called emergent space-time, same thing, where space and time emerge from other things. So we do have examples of things in physics which are more supported than any philosophical concept that can exist outside of space and time. But yeah, that really has nothing to do with Thomism, but it's just a trivial point. So to go into Thomism,
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
I
So I just
agree
want
with.
to push back a little bit on that,
All right,
if that's okay.
sure,
So
go
I just
for it.
want to ask I just want to ask some questions about it. So what does it mean then for an object for a natural object or being to be outside of space and time? What is it? What is it? Is it a concrete, definite being? I mean, does it have like, is it made of matter still? Like, what are we proposing exactly? And what is your conception of matter? What is their conception, namely, of matter in that case? Because if the thing about physics is that it gets increasingly abstract. So if we're talking about mathematical models and stuff, you're not really describing any ontology. You're simply describing certain things in the mathematical quantitative sense, but that doesn't tell us anything about what it is. And so that's what
Um,
I would ask about what is it exactly that we're talking about.
well, that's the thing is that physics doesn't answer
Mm.
the ontology question. It's purely epistemic. So it says this is what we know
Okay.
so far. This is what we can represent, and then we call that
Mm-hmm.
ontology. So like we call
Right.
particles an existing thing when really they're just
Mm-hmm.
made of like energy, and we don't know what energy actually fundamentally is. It's just energy. That's all we can do is
Mm-hmm.
describe it as saying it's energy,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't really know what energy fundamentally is. So it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
actually answer the question of ontology. It just says space and time are physical things that we can measure and represent, and they're parts of the universe, and there's something more
Mm-hmm.
fundamental. We know there's something more fundamental. So it
So
doesn't
what is
actually,
it? Mm.
we don't know.
Oh
It
yeah.
doesn't it
So.
doesn't
Mm-hmm.
say specifically what it is. It just says we know
Mm-hmm.
here's what space and time is, and we know there's something more
Mm-hmm.
fundamental than those things.
Okay. But what does it mean to be then physical? Because you said that these are physical items. So what does it mean to be physical under your view then, or at least under these scientific views that you're appealing to?
It just means measurable in some sense. So it's
Measurable.
just
Okay.
discernible through the known laws of physics. So all of these different theories
Mm-hmm.
are combinations of principles, particles, and laws in physics that
Mm-hmm.
have been measured. So
Mm-hmm.
these are just different combinations of those. So it is a measurable, physical, or natural kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. And so this world that's outside of space and time, it's measurable then in some sense.
Yep.
And so if it's measurable, then it has a quantity, right? And so if it has a quantity, then it has some finitude, I would say, in it, some actuality and potentiality in it. And so I don't think that this would necessarily circumvent the argument. I think it necessarily still has to have a mixture of active potency. But I know you're gonna probably want to get to the Thomism, so that's probably where you're
That's a,
gonna want
that's
to
a good
address
that's
later.
a good
So,
segue into Thomism. So in
yeah.
regards to Thomism, I agree with Martin Luther, who said that proof by assertion is reliance over style over substance, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not really a form of evidence.
Mm-hmm.
It's what Martin Luther said was, "It seems to me, I think so, I believe so," is essentially his
Mm-hmm.
summary of Thomism. And so when you say things like being and non-being, act and potency, essence and existence,
Mm-hmm.
these are all reifications of abstract objects. Like change isn't a thing. There is no essence of
Mm-hmm.
change. Change is just an abstract description between other things and how they interact. So like particles move through time, we call that change, but change isn't a thing itself. It's like, for
Mm-hmm.
example, up isn't a direction. We can say an
Mm-hmm.
object moves and say, well, this is going up. But really, up isn't a thing. It's just an abstract relation we give to the object, and usually gravity or something.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
like I could say, phlogiston is the essence of everything going up. And so, oh, that thing's going up, therefore it has the property of phlogiston. And
Mm-hmm.
this leads to some kind of instantiation of phlogiston-ness that must exist in the universe because it's describing all the things that go up, therefore, and this instantiation would indicate the flying spaghetti monster or something like that. So essentially,
Mm-hmm.
you can take any abstract quantity, give it a title of a property, and then use that property to indicate some kind of um, increase or relation to indicate the instantiation of that property. But you can do this with anything.
Mm-hmm.
Just make up any property you want and do this. So
Mm-hmm.
all of these things you said, the essence, existence, act, potency, being, non-being, there isn't any evidence to show these actually exist. They're just abstract concepts, the labels that have been
Mm-hmm.
placed on things that exist in the world, which is
Mm-hmm.
essentially the main criticism of Thomism, that it's essentially just
Mm-hmm.
applying labels and then calling those labels real things, which is a reification, and then using that
Mm-hmm.
reification to indicate an instantiation of it like a real thing in the world, which it can't do.
Mm-hmm.
Because the first thing you have to do is, with any epistemology, is show what's the difference between the thing I'm labeling, is it real or imaginary? How do I show this isn't just a part of my imagination? And with science, we
Mm-hmm.
do that with novel testable predictions. If I
Mm-hmm.
say phlogiston is a thing, well, I have to give it properties and say, okay, I can show this is the case because I can make predictions about the future which other people can't predict. And that would be evidence
Mm-hmm.
that this exists outside of my imagination. But with Thomism,
Mm-hmm.
you can't seem to do that. They're just applying labels to things we already exist, that we already know about,
Mm-hmm.
which in
Mm-hmm.
science is just, you can do that with anything. You can say, like in quantum mechanics, we see Copenhagen interpretation, we see these effects occurring. We can label them in lots of different ways. Maybe it's the multiverse, maybe it's string theory, maybe it's magical leprechauns. You can label them in any way you want, but if you can't differentiate them from
Mm-hmm.
being imaginary and real, then you have no evidence. And for me, it seems like
Mm-hmm.
Thomism has that flaw, is that it's just labeling things with no substantive evidence to demonstrate these labels are correct.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, do you believe that change is real then? That change really exists?
No, I think
That it's a real process in
change
the
is an
world?
abstract concept that describes real things. Change itself is not a real thing.
Mm-hmm. Change itself is not a real thing. So what I'm describing, so I'm saying change is a description of something that actually occurs in the real world. It's a process of things that happen in the world. So I'm not saying change is a thing in itself. I never said that change is a thing, like an object, like some ontology here. That's some stuff you can grab onto. So I'm simply describing, saying that change is a description of the way things are, the way things happen to be in the events in the actual world, whether it's in your mind or it's in the external world itself. Change seems to be a real event. So I'm not saying it's a real thing. Change itself is a real thing. So it's a description of a process.
Well, no, that's the thing, is change isn't a
Mm-hmm.
process. Change is just a
Mm-hmm.
description of a process. So there
Exactly.
isn't
Yeah.
like when you try to say that change, there must be a first changer or something, like a first mover to cause
Mm-hmm.
the initial change. Well, that's not true, because change is an
Mm-hmm.
emergent property of interacting multiple things.
And change is simply an emergent property. Can you define that? What you mean by emergent property? Because it seems to me when something emerges, that itself is an instance of change. Like when something emerging, something out of some kind of collection of particles or whatever, however you want to define it. That seems to be an instance of change. Um, so I'm not quite sure because I don't think I'm not defining change as a thing in itself. Like I said, I am actually saying it's a description of a process. I'm saying that as well. I'm not denying that. It's just I'm not sure what you're saying exactly.
So it's an abstract concept. Abstract concepts
Mm-hmm.
don't exist. They're not real.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't use an abstract concept to try and instantiate a real thing and say, well, because there must be change, there must be a changer. That's it's
Mm-hmm.
I forget.
Wait, so change is abstract? Are you saying change is an abstract object?
Yes, uh, yes. I wouldn't say it's an abstract object. I'd just say it's an abstract concept.
Abstract concept.
Because I'm not a Platonist, so I
Okay.
don't think there are actually
Yeah, oh
abstract
right.
objects.
Right. I feel like that's really strange to say an abstract object is change. Like the number one, it doesn't undergo any change. It seems to say that in order to define change as an abstract object, that seems to go against common sense. I mean, I'm moving here. It doesn't seem to be an abstract concept. It's not something that's just in my head, unless you want to say it's just like ideas, if you're like an idealist or something of that sort. And
Well,
even in
right.
that case,
Let me clarify a little bit. So
mm-hmm,
when we move, that is
mm-hmm,
something. But what that is matter and
mm-hmm,
energy. There's no change. Change isn't a part of that.
mm-hmm,
We just label it change. So this
mm-hmm,
is all matter and energy interacting in some way in space-time. That's what it is. So there's a
mm-hmm,
beginning to matter and energy, but there
mm-hmm,
isn't the change. The change isn't a part of it. So when we see matter and energy move, we can say that had a beginning at like the Big Bang, but
mm-hmm,
that doesn't mean that this idea of change applies to everything before that, because it doesn't. Because we
mm-hmm,
know of things that can be outside of space and time that don't have the change feature, like things that Hilbert space, which just exist in all possible dimensions at the same time, where things can both exist and not exist at the same time, Schrodinger's cat. The laws of our conceptions of change break down before the Big Bang in quantum mechanics. So this idea of change that we apply to things like matter and energy motion don't apply to those fundamental levels. It's just an abstract label we apply to things like up. It's like there's
mm-hmm,
no up before the Big Bang. Up is just a
mm-hmm,
relation that we apply to things. So you can't say apply the concept of
mm-hmm,
up prior to the Big Bang. It doesn't make any sense.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so that seems to really relativize. Okay, I can understand the up and down analogy, I suppose. It depends on what, relative to your position, what you're talking about, what up or down is. But then it seems like in how you're explaining, change, matter and energy interacting in itself, the instance of change that we're talking about. So I'm not saying, it just seems weird to me because it seems like you're taking change as this concept and I'm just reifying it, but change just picks out a process. So if you're picking, it's just that word that we say change, that's just picking out a certain process in the world, and that process is going to be matter and energy interacting with each other, or
Right, right.
whatever the objects of our sensory experiences are occurring.
It picks out
So
a
that's change.
process. It's not all
Mhm.
processes. You're applying them to all processes. It's picking out a
Okay.
process, and that process
Hmm.
has a beginning because it's the process of matter
Okay.
and energy. But it doesn't
Right.
apply to all processes. That's the difference
Hmm.
here. Is you're taking an abstract concept, labeling
Hmm.
this one process with that abstract concept, and extrapolating it to all processes.
No, so I'm only applying that to things, processes that are actually undergoing change, though, in some sense. Like I'm not as far as as far as those things that when I'm saying something's changing, I'm not saying that everything is changing. I'm not saying all things are changing.
Oh, right,
You know,
right.
I'm simply saying that with the things that we do that see are changing, the things that are like the description of process, those are like in matter and energy interacting in different ways. That is change, and so as far as that is in fact occurring, you know, you have to account for why that's occurring. How is that possible in the first place? And that necessitates the introduction of something like active potency as real features of the world in order to explain why change is occurring at any level.
Well, no,
Whether
that's the part where I'm objecting to. That's a
mm-hmm,
false dichotomy.
mm-hmm,
There's many ways to
mm-hmm,
introduce change without that necessary potent or an active potency distinction. That's only one
mm-hmm,
way to potentially explain change. I don't think it does. I think it's just an abstract description. But we can have
mm-hmm,
change as a fundamental nature of reality, as again in like quantum states. If we can just say there
mm-hmm,
is a quantum field that exists, quantum
mm-hmm,
fields inherently generate change. The quantum field isn't changing at all, but it can cause
mm-hmm,
change in space-time events.
mm-hmm,
You can get that without act and potency. That is a process that exists eternally and can cause
mm-hmm.
change, but isn't itself changing in that sense.
So it seems to me that you're simply saying it does change without explaining how it's possible for change to occur. Like, for example, if all we have is being, the way something is, you know, that's just the way it is, like with the way that quantum state vector is, how it is, it's not going to be able to, what makes it possible then to produce change is it has a potential to produce that. You know, it has that potential to cause that in some other object, say, you
Well,
know,
no,
and some other
no.
object has a potential to produce it.
So in physics, there's
Mm-hmm.
no potential. There's no potential energy. There's
Mm-hmm.
no potential. It's just inherent
So
into its nature.
I So I think that's very, I think that's dubious because like Heisenberg, he appealed to potentiality as real aspects of the world. So it seems to be at least very much a plausible explanation of things. I don't think the quantum mechanics is in any way decisively accounted for change in the way that we're talking about. You're simply what quantum mechanics does. It describes the process of change, but it doesn't yet account for that process of change. So that's what we're trying to do is provide an ontological account for change, not simply describe it, because that's you can describe change, sure. You can have a quantum world that describes change, but what is the ontology of that change? What makes change possible in the first place? The very preconditions of change require a certain
Well,
ontology for
remember
that to
that's
rise.
the part I'm saying. Change is
Mm-hmm,
abstract, so there is no ontology of
mm-hmm,
change.
mm-hmm. But that just seems to be asserting why should it be abstract? It's a real concrete thing. Change is a process that we see in the world. It's
No,
concrete.
no,
Like for
that's the
example,
part.
when
No, no.
something
So
changes color,
change isn't a
or
concrete thing. Change is an
mm-hmm,
abstract thing that we apply to concrete things. So changes in
mm-hmm,
color is a concrete thing, but change
mm-hmm,
itself doesn't apply to that. You can't use the word change to that because it's not what it is. What it is a physical process interaction between matter and energy. So we know matter and energy
mm-hmm,
have a beginning essentially at the Big Bang,
mm-hmm,
but that same concept of change doesn't apply to anything else. It only applies to matter and energy. There are things that in the quantum
mm-hmm,
range it doesn't apply to. Um, there are certain things in quantum mechanics that do have potential energy, which I'm
mm-hmm,
sure is what Heisenberg was referring to, but not all things do. That's not how it
mm-hmm,
works because there are certain fields that are just they're fields. They don't have potential energy. They just
mm-hmm,
are. So, if, for example,
mm-hmm.
Stephen Hawking said the net energy of the universe is zero. It doesn't have
Mm-hmm.
potential energy. It just is. So
Mm-hmm.
the concept, applying the concept of change, how we see it in the physical world, doesn't apply to the quantum level. It's just taking an abstract concept and then just extrapolating it to everything. Like if I said
Yeah,
up,
so I don't.
if I
Mm-hmm.
see something go up, well, we can just say up is a direction and applies to everything. Well, we know it doesn't because if
Mm-hmm.
you're on the other side of the world, what I see as up is what you should see as down. So
Mm-hmm.
taking that abstract concept, you can't apply it universally. They're just ideas. You would need some way to
Mm-hmm.
demonstrate these aren't just ideas by like making
Mm-hmm.
testable predictions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you acknowledge though that this change that I'm referring to actually exists in the macroscopic world at the very least, correct? You
Right,
acknowledge
right.
that that is real of the macroscopic world, but you're saying that of the microscopic world, it just simply stops applying. So that's what you're kind of saying. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, sort of. So there
Mm-hmm.
is a thing that we label change, but change isn't a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that we
Mm-hmm.
label change is real, a part of the world is matter and energy, and that definitely had a beginning. But you can't
Hmm.
extrapolate from that that all processes have a beginning. It's a composition division
Hmm.
fallacy. So we know
Hmm.
this process had a beginning. It doesn't mean all processes have a beginning.
Well, since all processes is one going from one event to another event, for example, that is itself an instance of change. So change is simply a process. That's not a thing because you keep saying it's a thing. I'm confounded by that because I don't say it's a thing. It's a process. And so no matter what process you say, any type of process is going to be an instance of change. It's going to be an example of change. Our concept simply picks out that process. It's just a word that you pick out. Just like we have, say, the word red is just picking out something we observe in the world, or we have, say, particles or some body of objects, some body of extension, say, we're just picking that out in the world. We're not saying that the concept itself is the real thing. We're not saying the change of concept itself is the real thing. We're simply saying the concept of change is picking out some process that actually occurs in the world.
Well, no,
Um,
no.
eh,
Again,
mhm,
that's the false dichotomy. So I can give you a few
mhm,
instances of change that have nothing to do with that at all. So one would be the block
mhm,
universe, where everything just exists simultaneously. There is no change
mhm,
in the block universe in the sense that you're using it. There is still
mhm,
something you can call change, but it's
mhm,
completely different concept in every way. So it wouldn't
mhm,
apply in the Thomistic world. It would just defeat the Thomistic world entirely. Same with
mhm,
infinite regress would also defeat the Thomistic world entirely, or circular, where something causes itself, would defeat the Thomistic world entirely. Those are all instances of change that don't have a beginning. And we have physical
mhm,
instances of like that. So like in quantum mechanics, that's more of something outside of change, which can then cause change. But it doesn't change. It's the Hilbert spaces don't change. They cause change, but they don't
mhm,
change. They just exist. So
mhm.
each one of these is an example of something changing in the Thomistic sense that defeats Thomism. So these
Mhm.
can happen. The way that Thomists apply the word change don't apply to these examples.
Okay, so in those examples, what does change mean then? And when you're saying that there's change in those worlds in some way, but not change as a Thomist understands it. So what does that mean exactly? What is change in those particular worlds that you're talking about?
So there's the essence essentially of the Hilbert space, and the Hilbert space has
Mm-hmm.
some essence which can
Mm-hmm.
result in a statistical difference in spacetime. So the Hilbert space doesn't
Mm-hmm.
change at all, but stuff in
Mm-hmm.
spacetime changes because of the Hilbert space.
Mm-hmm. So the Hilbert space has some kind of causal power that's exerting onto the thing itself. Is that what it is? Or simply a math? So like I need to brush up on that to be honest. But so in that model, is it trying to say that it's static and somehow it's just still causing some differences in some concrete world?
Yeah, so it would be analogous to how
Mm-hmm.
you see as God
Mm-hmm.
being outside of just pure act, pure
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in that sense. So it'd kind of be like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So is it? But the thing is, like even you're saying that physics doesn't actually explain the ontology of it. It doesn't explain what it is that's not changing. It's simply saying there's some non-changing thing we can maybe describe in some mathematical sense, perhaps. But that mathematical sense, why should we think that those mathematical, those mathematical concepts, those mathematical descriptions we have that are actually real, like they actually really exist and that they're even possible in the first place? Like, how do we know that they're possible things to exist that can possibly exist?
Well, physics is more supported than anything in philosophy. So physics is a
Mm-hmm.
combination of principles, particles, and laws that have been verified, and we're just combining them in different ways. So
Mm-hmm.
the multiverse, for example, is a combination of vacuum states and early universe inflation. So
Mm-hmm.
both of those we have empirically verified. So everything in physics already has a good evidential basis, more than anything in philosophy, because philosophy is essentially we're just
Mm-hmm.
taking concepts in our
Wait.
minds and applying them to reality.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas physics, it's taking physical concepts we have demonstrated to exist in reality and combining them in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
So does that make sense that physics is more supported than philosophical assertions? Physical theories are more supported than philosophical theories.
So I don't think that would work though, because physics just has to assume certain categories, the way thing actually is. There's actuality, the way something actually is. It has to make use of those concepts. Like there are very preconditions of physics depends on the metaphysical understanding of the world. And so when you say that it's more supported, like I just think it's a little too dismissive. Like we have Heisenberg, who just simply did not say, "Oh, potentialities exist in the macroscopic world." She appealed to it in the microscopic world. He said it makes perfect sense of the quantum world. And he's a very well-renowned physicist who appealed in this way. So we have him saying, for example, when we talk about superpositions or the collapse of the wave function and all these things, these are best explained by potencies. These state vectors are actually describing potentials of that system. So superpositions, for example, are just simply there are different potentials to be in certain areas simultaneously. Potentials can be have different contrariety of potentials simultaneously in potency. So that's what Heisenberg was saying. And I just don't think that this is immediately settled science. Like somehow physics has just simply dismissed it. And this whole notion, like, well, the notion of multiverse, like, I don't see any kind of like, what do you mean by empirical support? Do you just simply mean it's like empirically supported, like it's a possible model that can make coherent sense? Or do you actually believe that there are multiverses in the real world? Do you think that's settled by science at the moment, or what are you
Uh,
claiming there?
no, not exactly. I mean, like, if we're
Mm-hmm.
trying to explain some event, like what knocked over a cup, if I add in things
Mm-hmm.
like, well, it could be the squirrel, it could be the wind, it could be
Mm-hmm.
a bird or something. If I add in things that
Mm-hmm.
we already have empirical support for, that
Mm-hmm.
explanation is going to be a better, more supported explanation than if I add in things that we don't have empirical support for. So if I said
Mm-hmm.
aliens or leprechauns or magic, those
Mm-hmm.
explanations would be inferior to the explanations of the squirrel or a bird or wind because they already have
Mm-hmm.
empirical support. So in the case of physics, they're adding in things that already have empirical support, like a bird or a wind. In the case of the multiverse, it's the early universe inflation and vacuum states. Those are empirically demonstrated things like birds and squirrels. So saying that
Mm-hmm.
these things can cause the change that we see in the universe is more plausible than saying it's act and potency or being and essence and all of these other descriptive terms, because these don't have empirical support. These are just descriptions we apply to things.
No, I would say that's false because the empirical support is that there's the way a thing actually is. We see how features are actually are. It's like the particles. We see state vectors. We see how those states are, whether they're positive, negative states. We see that those are the ways that they actually are in being. And then there's also the way it potentially is. So we see potentials in an indirect sense, I suppose, in that we see that change is occurring. We see that it goes from a different state to another state. We see processes even in physical quantum world changing. We see even common sense tells me that this my hand is here has a potential to open up. So it opened up. There's a potential there. It's not actual yet. I have potential to open my hand up, but now there it is. It's empirical. I can verify that. And so what we active potencies is picking out things that actually really occur in life and simply explaining how it's possible for us to see those things, how it's possible for there to be change at all. And it states the very preconditions of reality. I don't see it as actually just a concept. It's a reification. I think you're simply I don't know. I just don't understand why you see it that way.
Well, that's the consensus in philosophy is that you've
Mm-hmm.
taken these things that we see and you give them a title,
Mm-hmm.
but we can just give
Mm-hmm.
them a different title. We can apply different concepts to them, different ideas of ontology other than Thomistic ontology, and those are equally supported. Like the
Consensus
infinite,
by who though? What philosophers are you appealing to?
um, what's it, the Paul, Phil Survey's paper, I think.
Mm-hmm. So
So,
did they actually say that this is just Thomism is just word games? Is that what they say?
well, I know that's specifically what Bertrand Russell and Martin Luther and the many philosophers I've read about it have specifically said about Thomism, but they usually consider
Mm-hmm.
the more generally like the theistic enterprise to be not as more about word games. So I can
Mm-hmm.
definitely find I can try to find studies specifically on Thomism if you want, but it's
Mm-hmm.
theism itself is a minority position in philosophy, and Thomism is a minority position in that. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not hard to make that extrapolation. So
Well, I think that's a stretch though, simply because even if it was the case, for example, like this minority, like yeah, okay, so it's minority for now at this point in time, um, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone thinks it's nonsense or just gibberish or it's just word games. I think that that's not justified by the consensus. I mean, you can respect the view and say, yeah, okay, that makes sense, but at the same time, it's false. It's I can see what you're saying, but it's just false. I think that's more likely what they're saying. I haven't really encountered that kind of dismissive attitude, especially because we have E.J. Lowe, we have John Haldane, we got Robert Pasnow, we got Kit Fine, one of the eminent Aristotelians of today. We have David Oderberg. We have all these great thinkers like Nancy Cartwright, Stephen Munford. These guys they know their stuff, and they're modern philosophers, and everyone respects them in the field. And no one's making a charge. Oh, you're just kind of making language games. You're making word games, and it's gibberish. I don't see that as actual plausible inference from this fact that there's a consensus necessarily.
I think
Um,
that's usually exactly I don't think they use those words specifically, but they're saying
mm-hmm.
that all you're doing is taking language and applying it. Like, say, if we see a phenomenon like something rising, You can say, well, that's
Mm-hmm.
phlogiston. There's a phlogiston particle that's causing it to rise. And someone else can say, oh,
Mm-hmm.
no, 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 it's not. It's just the particles are just expanding, which is what's causing it to rise. You can apply two different ontologies to describe what change is. It could be like a
Mm-hmm.
Thomistic kind of ontology, or it could just be a different kind of ontology, like a physics kind of ontology. And simply
Mm-hmm.
saying, well, the Thomistic kind of ontology applies to everything, well, I can just say the physics kind of ontology applies to everything. So
The problem is
it's
that by your own, by what we said though, is that physics doesn't even have an ontology.
right. It doesn't.
So,
Right. So
and that's
so
a
physics
problem.
doesn't go that
Mm-hmm.
far. No one does because the
Mm-hmm.
correct answer is
Mm-hmm.
we don't know. But anyone can. You can
Mm-hmm.
take physics and then just say,
Mm-hmm.
okay, here's the fundamental ontology. We're just going to apply it to everything and be done. But that's just
Mm-hmm.
not a supported conclusion for anything. And that's exactly what Thomists are doing. They're taking the ideas, the concepts they have, and just saying, oh, this is the fundamental ontology, which isn't supported. And
Mm-hmm.
anybody can do that. We can do that with physics and say, here's the fundamental ontology, and it's everything, which of course also wouldn't be supported. So that's
Mm-hmm.
why the philosophers don't really see Thomism as a strong argument because it's just taking an idea and asserting that it exists, like proof by assertion. And it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't really work because you can just make proof by assertion of a different ontology and it'll be equally supported.
Mm-hmm. So I've seen a lot of philosophers, I study a lot of philosophers. I've been under calculated way, people who are not Thomists, they don't use that objection. They don't say Thomism is just word games. They usually just simply say, well, we just have better metaphysical and we have better metaphysics. We don't need that anymore. Or they kind of have this idea of like, oh, it's outdated. We don't need to appeal to final causality. We have certain things like efficient causality suffices to explain the world. It isn't to the extent what you're saying, well, we can just we can describe whatever we like and add words to it. I just think that that's just not true. And we
How are
have
those two
very,
different? Because when you're saying we have
mhm,
different metaphysics, we're saying we have different
yeah.
ideas, different word games that we can play to say, well, here's what they are. And these are more supported, they're saying, is that
So
we have better
well, that's
metaphysics.
your projection though onto the metaphysics like landscape because when they're not saying, oh, we just have different ways of describing it. They're just like, well, this is the better way. This is the truer way. They're not saying we're just playing word games. We're not saying, oh, I'm just going to describe it this way, blob, schlob, and that's it. Metaphysics is not simply doing that. It's like it's actually really trying to actually get to the heart of what is like, accounting for actually how change occurs. So, like for example, being is not a made-up word. It's common sense. It's not like you can describe it some other way. It's the way something actually is. It's actuality, how a thing actually is. It's round. It's rubber. A particle is actually of this particular sort. It's of this particular charge. You know, you're describing things that it actually is. Being is a real category. Non-being, the way things are not, is real. Is in some sense actual. It says something true about reality as well when I say that you're not a zebra, you know, you're not, I'm not, I don't see a zebra sitting in front of me right now. That's a true statement. That's that the zebra is non-being where at this moment here. What's being is here is Tom. That's the actuality at this moment. That isn't just made up words. Those are actually just picking out real empirical claims about the actual world, things that has to be in order for there to be any world at all. So if there is no actuality, there can't be any experience. There can't be you. There can't be any existence. Actuality is fundamental. Being is fundamental.
Well,
So
again,
those aren't
that's
just made up words.
those are made up words. So
Mm-hmm.
just saying being is fundamental is just like saying um, zebras are fundamental. Like I can make up a
Mm-hmm.
word and say this applies universally to everything, but you haven't presented any way to differentiate your
So that's what,
assertion.
so no philosopher would agree with you with that. No metaphysician will ever agree with you that being is just a made up word as much as like zebra or schlob that we can use it to mean anything. They would say being is a real feature that you need being in order for there to be anything at all. Like in order for you to experience anything, there has to be being.
No, being
And
is an
so,
abstract concept. So
mm-hmm.
you're applying it again. It's a reification. I'm just taking this straight
Mm-hmm.
from Russell in his critique.
Mm-hmm.
So there are
Mm-hmm.
actually the biggest, most famous philosophers in the world have said this
Mm-hmm.
repeatedly. Even modern philosophers say this, and I can get you the quotes because I have them. Because I
Mm-hmm.
actually use them against my debate against Ben Arbour. So
Mm-hmm.
these concepts, you're using words that apply generically to lots of different things, and then saying that these
Mm-hmm.
represent an essence of fundamental reality when they're just words that apply to lots of general different things.
Mm-hmm. Wait, so you wouldn't say, for example, that you are a being.
I would say that,
That
but it doesn't
you
mean
are
being
okay.
is a
So
thing.
then being is real then, because you are a thing. Like you are a type of thing. So being in self, you have some being in you
Like
have being in you.
like
So you don't.
I would say this cup is solid, but it's
Uh
not.
huh.
99% of it is empty space. So when I say I
Right.
am a being, it essentially falls into the problem of identity and the problem of the heap and Theseus's ship. Like no, There isn't that thing. There isn't a I am a being there. It's just an abstract description we apply to things. And there's lots of problems with that description, like where do I end and other things begin? We have no idea. It's just, and what does matter begin? Is matter even real? Are we in an idealistic universe? Is there like a Hilbert spaces? Are we all just a probability wave or a holographic universe principle? There is no being there. We have no idea what is actually there. We're just giving it labels and saying it is a being because it's useful for us. It doesn't mean there's an essence of being there.
So you're saying then, okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around this, so you might have to be patient with me on this. So when I'm understanding being is I'm simply saying anything that exists in some way, you know? So you're a thing that exists, so therefore you have being. I'm a thing that exists, therefore you have being. That particle is a thing that exists, therefore that particle has being. I'm not understanding it in any other different sense than that. And so I don't think that contradicts anything that you said from what I'm understanding. It simply seems to be being is fundamental to the world. It's then there without being there is nothing. That's just we can't. I feel like those are fundamental concepts, and I mean, you might appeal to like Russell, and you're appealing to Russell here, and I don't think Russell would make this disagreement. He wouldn't say there is no such thing as being. Being is just simply a mere fiction. But if he did, he'd probably be following maybe Wittgenstein, who did believe that this is all wordplay games, at least at one point in his career. The
Well,
case, and
I'm
that's
more
just you're just
specifically
selecting.
looking at it
Mhm.
from like a quantum physics perspective, where we don't exist.
Mhm.
We're just probability waves, essentially. There is no being there. There is
But
no
waves
being
do
there.
have being in some sense. There's something that
Right, right. So
exists,
in this
right?
analogy,
So the vector.
in
Hmm.
this analogy, I don't exist. The waves exist, and I am just
Hmm.
essentially a description we apply to something of the wave collapse function. There isn't me there. I'm not there. It's just a
Hmm.
wave collapse function. So
Hmm.
when we apply the word being to me, it's just an incorrect application of the word, like when I apply the word solid to an object, because
Hmm.
objects aren't solid, they're 99% empty space. So,
Hmm.
so it's that concept of being is something we generally apply to lots of different things, but it just doesn't
Hmm.
apply to lots of different things. It's just an abstract
So,
concept.
hmm so you're saying that there's no being to the wave function collapse. There's no quantum being.
Oh,
There's
no, no, no.
no way in which the quantum is.
So I'm saying if you use the word being to describe something like me, that could be
Hmm.
false. And here's one way it could be false. Now you can still abstractly use the word being to describe just anything, but the point is
Hmm.
that could also be false. So when you apply the word being to things, it's because the word is so abstract and not a well-defined term that you can apply it to anything you want and then claim that that is the essence of being. It's not actually evidence that there's an essence of being. It's just the term is so not well defined that you can just apply it to
Hmm.
anything you want. And
Hmm.
and then extrapolating from that non-well defined term to some instantiation of a pure essence or actuality isn't evidence of that existing. It's just you have a non-well-defined abstract term which you can then extrapolate to anything you want, or to something that
Hmm.
you want. So it's
Hmm.
again, you would have to actually demonstrate that your properties of being and potency, like or being and non-being, that these actually are things. That they're not just
Hmm.
abstract descriptions we're applying to things, but they're like real things in the world. Like I can demonstrate matter is real and energy is real and motion is real, but being and
That's
potency
being.
isn't no, no, you're just labeling that as being.
Matter is being. I
You're just
mean,
labeling
everyone
that.
would say,
You're labeling
okay.
that as being. So
So you're labeling matter as matter. Wouldn't that just follow? Like you're just labeling matter as matter. You're making labels too as well, it seems. Like what makes matter matter? Why pick out matter as why say that that's matter? It
we
just
can
seems
demonstrate
like
it. It's
what
not just a label. We can demonstrate it. It has properties, has demonstrable properties. Being
what
doesn't
are
have demonstrable
properties? What are
properties.
properties though? What are properties? Properties is a form of being. It's an
No, that's
aspect
just
of
a
being.
label. So again, properties are things we
No,
can
properties is a
demonstrate.
label too then. So what is properties then?
So
If
so
like we can't say anything if being is just an abstraction, you're reifying properties. It seems to me. Like you have to reify. If you're gonna say that being is a reification of reality, then properties are reifications of reality. Even saying matter is a reification of reality. Like you can't get around that either. If you're not gonna make any ontological claim about the world, everything that you say about the world, even if it's science, is gonna be a reification necessarily.
well, no, not exactly. So it starts off as there are things in
Mm-hmm.
our head and there are things in the world, and the things in my head
Mm-hmm.
are concepts, and then we take those concepts and then we reify them and say, well, do these apply to the world? And then we have to verify them. And
Mm-hmm.
if we verify them, it's no longer a reification. We can demonstrate they exist. So it's not a
Mm-hmm.
reification after we demonstrate them. It's an actual empirical object. So we start with conceptual objects and then reify them hypothetically, and then we demonstrate them to show they're not just reifications. That's the difference. In science, we start with concepts just like in Thomism and any other ideology, but then we show that these concepts actually apply to the world, and they're right, and they're not just concepts, whereas opposed to Thomism and many philosophical ideas just appeal to the concepts themselves without ever demonstrating they're more than concepts.
So if they're not just concepts, then they're actual things that exist. So therefore, they have being,
No, being is
right?
just a
And the
label again.
concepts,
So you can only say it's an
right?
actual thing in the world after you demonstrate it's an actual thing in the world.
Right. So if we're talking about, like, say, cats, it's an actual thing,
Right?
right? You agree that that cat
Yes.
has an actual thing.
Yes.
So therefore, it has being.
No.
Like that is a
No. So
being.
being is again label. You gotta actually demonstrate
Mhm.
being corresponds to something in reality. So you're gonna have to give a property definition. You have to give a testable predictions. And if you can't do that, then it's just a label. It's an abstract label. So you can't say being is a thing out there until you actually demonstrate it. Being is a thing. It has properties.
So you can't. That same reason says you can't demonstrate. Okay. So properties. How do you demonstrate a property exists then? What's your process of demonstrating that properties exist? Because
Now,
properties are very general. Properties are very general features of the world, just in the same way that being is. And so being is just like the most general aspect of something. And it's just like, oh, that thing has being. That thing has existence. It exists. That's all we're saying. We're not saying anymore. We're not making this conflict. We're not even introducing essences necessarily yet. I'm just simply saying. I'm not even saying, oh, this being here, this cup has solidity. I don't know. It could have different kind of being. Maybe it has being in terms of like some particles roaming around in certain ways, and those particles are the ones that actually have true being. Maybe so. But regardless, you have to appeal to being at some level of reality. Because the concept is just common sense. Everyone seems to agree it has being. That's how it differentiates things from concepts, is that something actually exists. It's an existing thing. That just is what it means to be a being. It's something that actually exists. And so like I don't see where you're getting this.
so the way I demonstrate actual properties is novel testable predictions. We say this thing has this property, and
Mm-hmm.
we can demonstrate this because if it has this property, I can make this prediction, and if this prediction is right, then that's a reason to believe it has property X or whatever. Being doesn't have that. Being is just an assertion. You asserted that being is the most fundamental thing. It may not be. There could be something more fundamental than being. We just don't know about, or we can't
No, I
imagine.
can verify. I can verify being. I see the cat that exists. My exists. I see you exist. I just verified being right now.
No, and that's
Being has
that's
just
an
been verified.
observation, not a prediction. So you'd have to say, if being is true, then here is something about the world I can predict that we don't know yet.
Hmm. So
So
like I feel like you could still say the same thing about properties then still. Like, okay, can you discover properties in general? Because properties is a general concept.
no, you
You
can't you
know,
can't
it's
discover
it's
properties
it's
in general, but you can discover independent
hmm.
properties. We're just labeling them properties. They're not
Okay.
like an
Independent.
actual
Okay, so now
property.
I can then discover independent beings in the same way though. Like when I'm talking about beings, I'm talking about this particular being, that particular being. That's what I mean by being. It's evident to the senses. Like if there is no being, prediction is that there would be nothing to observe. If no being exists, there'd be nothing to observe. But since something exists, necessarily there is being.
So we don't actually demonstrate properties by describing things in the world. We demonstrate a
Hmm.
property and a different property, and then we label these properties. The label of properties isn't supported by evidence. It's just a made-up label, just like being is a made-up label. So there isn't such a thing as properties. There are specific instances that we call certain things like matter and energy, and then we label those categories as properties. But properties don't exist. Properties is just an
Hmm.
abstract description, just like being is. So we can't demonstrate
Hmm.
properties just like we can't demonstrate being, but we can demonstrate matter, and we can demonstrate energy, and we can demonstrate spin, and we label those categories as properties. And we can label them as being. That doesn't mean being is a thing.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean properties are a thing. We can't just
So you're
extrapolate that.
labeling you're labeling these things matter. Then you're just adding those terminologies to it, right? You can't really prove matter itself exists. Is that what you're gonna say as well?
Te-
Because
te-
matter is a type of being. It's a material being, right? You're gonna talk about matter. What is matter? Matter is a material being. It doesn't make sense to me.
so again, if I want to say something exists and isn't a part of my imagination, I can say if it exists, we can make a
Hmm.
prediction about what's going to happen in the world. So if matter exists, like if I drop this cup, it'll make a sound. If I drop it and it makes a sound, well then we have reason to believe it
Hmm.
exists, and we can label that as matter. Now, of course, it
Hmm.
could just be a probability wave or something if we go to quantum mechanics,
Hmm.
but we do have reason to believe matter is real because we can
Hmm.
demonstrate it is different from our imagination. We can't do that
Hmm.
for being. We can't do that for properties in general. We
Yeah,
have
matter is being. So you just did it right
no,
now.
no,
I
you're just
mean,
labeling it. So
that
again,
is.
if you want to claim
Mm-hmm.
this property of being, you have to show if being is real, then what can I make? What novel prediction can I make to demonstrate being is real? You
What
can't
do you
just label
understand being
things.
to be? What do you understand being to be? Because
It's a label.
like it just
It's a
seems.
label.
What does it mean though? Like what
It's
is being?
anything, the existence of
It
anything,
doesn't mean
anything
just
that exists.
anything. It doesn't just mean anything. It just means anything that does exist. So
Right.
that that it's just and then matter is anything that's quantifiable, right? You're just defining matter in that particular way. So I see the
Um,
whole thing is parallel. If you want to say matter, material things, right? He said physical because earlier you defined physical things as anything that can be quantified. Anything can be quantified by our mathematical models and stuff. Um, so I just don't see it as anything different. There seem to be completely parallel things, cases here.
I'm not following. Could
You,
you go through that one more time?
okay. So, when you're talking about matter, like when you're saying, because I'm defining being as just anything that exists, right? And I ask you what is matter, and you define that as something that's quantifiable. You're saying something. You necessarily have to introduce the being part because any being is a something. But anyways, going to, basically the point is that you're defining matter in a certain way. You're saying being is something that it has a quantifiable being. You have to say that okay, this is something that exists. Matter is something that exists. And I just don't see how you can go around that. I mean, it's parallel cases. What do you say matter is when you say matter exists? I can just say, okay, matter exists. Sure, that's being.
Okay, so in the case of matter, when I'm trying to describe matter, I wasn't trying to
Mm-hmm.
give it a technical definition there. So in my
Mm-hmm.
analogy, any property you want to claim exists, you have to demonstrate it. You have to say, if this property exists, we have to make novel testable predictions to demonstrate it exists. Now, we claim matter exists, and it's going to have properties of like being made of protons and neutrons and electrons, and then we can demonstrate this with certain tests, and we call that
Mm-hmm.
matter. So I wouldn't, if I tried to like define what is the essence of matter and what would be the absolute basal form of matter, I have no idea, not a clue, wouldn't even try. So when I'm
Okay, so you don't
defining,
even know what matter is. Okay.
no, we don't. So
All
that's
right.
science doesn't answer any of those questions. Science doesn't even try to because we can't. That's
Mm-hmm.
kind of why Thomism doesn't work and those kind of metaphysical ontologies don't work is because they're making assertions about the fundamental nature of reality, which we can't demonstrate. They're all just, we don't have any way to show that these metaphysical claims are real as opposed to imaginary. So that's why
All right. So
science
you.
doesn't answer those
Mhm.
questions.
But the thing is, you said that science needs to demonstrate that something exists.
Yes.
That itself is that something that exists. Existence in itself is being. You're appealing to
Right.
something, okay, it has to be being that exists in the external world. Something exists that corresponds to it. You can't make any sense of demonstrating anything if there is no thing, no being to it from which to demonstrate. Being is a very precondition of the demonstration. You can't, you have to, there has to be being in order for there to be even for you to even say intelligibly that we have to demonstrate its existence. That whole claim, demonstrate its existence, it assumes being. It assumes being because being is something that exists.
Right. Being is just the description of things that exist, but that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
lead to anything. So we can describe things that exist, but that doesn't follow that therefore anything. It's just a description. So if you want to say that,
It follows that something does exist. Named a cat, you exist in some way. We don't know the exact way. You can say, oh well, the quantum world kind of messes how we think of how that exists, but it still exists in some way. It's still a kind of being. No matter what you appeal to, whether it's matter, whether it's energy, that exists. And insofar as it exists, it has being
well, that's
necessarily.
the part. It exists in some kind of way. Like there's lots of
Mm-hmm.
different ways it could exist. That's the
Mm-hmm.
problem, is that we don't know what the ontology of what existence is. It's just a label we apply to things. There's lots of,
Mm-hmm.
you're right, there's lots of different ways it could exist. And just calling all of
Mm-hmm.
them existence is just vague. You can't do that because
Mm-hmm.
each of the different ways of existing could have different consequences and lead to different ontologies. So just
Mm-hmm.
saying, well, we're just going to call whatever way it exists, just existence as a general property, and then extrapolate from that one kind of ontology doesn't follow. Because there's lots of different ways it could exist, and there's lots of different ontologies that can describe that existence.
Mm-hmm. Well, so yeah, there's a lot of described existence, but they all have existence in common. So you have existence in common with that cat. I have existence in common with you. These are certain aspects so those things that we have in common, that's being. That's just what we're saying. So there's a real things in the world that being is something it just is. It's one of these fundamental terms that we use all the time and we have to use. So like the way something actually is, what is matter in comparison to energy, we're going to pick out properties. You're going to have to pick out properties, certain descriptive features of how these things work. You're going to pick them out, and it's going to describe in some way its being, you
Well, right,
know?
right. So we use the label
Mm-hmm.
being for things that exist, but we can't use the
Mm-hmm.
label being and then extrapolate an ontology from that. We can't do that. That's not possible because
Mm-hmm.
it's just an abstract concept. We don't know what being actually is. We don't know the ontology of being, whereas you're taking the being and then extrapolating from that abstract concept an ontology, which is what you can't
Mm-hmm.
do. So I agree the concept of being applies to things that exist, but it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
tell us anything about those. It could be, there's lots of different ways they could exist. There's lots of different ontologies that could explain what being is. It's just a label
Mm-hmm.
we give to things. So,
Mm-hmm.
so when you're taking the concepts of being and non-being, essence and existence and act and potency, and then extrapolating from these an ontology, which is only one possible ontology that can explain all of those things with different labels. They use different concepts to describe what those are. And that's the problem, is that there's lots of different ways to explain being. There's lots of different ways to explain change. There's lots of different ways to explain motion. There's the way that you're interpreting them as just general concepts that apply to a specific ontology is the part I'm objecting to.
Okay, so first thing to be clear, right now, for now, I just want to focus on being and non-being. We're going to know potency and stuff like that for now. But so if that's the case, then I'm just saying, I understand what you're saying, the different ways in which a thing could be. There's different ways in which a thing could exist. They can different exist in different ways. But the thing is that they all these things have in common is that there are things that exist. There are things that have being. That's what they have in common. These are the features that they have in common. So like it seems like it's not,
No, 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 no,
there's
no, no,
no.
no, no. They don't have that in
Mhm,
common. That's just a label we
mhm,
apply to them. That's not. It's
mhm.
not like a.
So the cat and you don't have existence in common. You
That's
guys
a
don't both
label we
exist.
apply to the cat. We don't know what that means. It's not something it
We
has
don't
in common across all worldviews. It's
we
our
don't know what existence
description.
means?
No, we
We
don't know
don't
what
know what
existence
existence
means.
means?
No, we don't. We have
Really?
no idea.
Okay.
Like it could be particles, it could be waves, it could be idealistic, it could be all kinds of things. We have no idea what the fundamental nature of existence is. It's just a label we apply to things that we
Mhm.
interact with.
So you don't know what it means for you to exist. You say, if I said, "Do you exist, Tom?" And like, I don't know what it means to exist. Was that something you would say?
To the ontology, yes, we have no idea what the ontology of existence is. We know an epistemic existence, which we could describe how we exist, and we label it existence, but that doesn't tell us anything about the ontology of existence at all.
Yeah, but we know the concept to exist is something to simply be real. It's just like I exist, like unlike the concept of like unicorn. We can differentiate those two, non-being unicorn and me. I exist. Unicorn does not exist. It's simply a mental concept. These are two different things, and so we know existence is something like I am, since I exist, and we can differentiate in terms of relating them together. So we know the difference between the two. We may not be able to give precise. Okay, let me give an exact, precise account of ontology, but we need to know what existence is in general. At least we say, okay, this thing exists, this doesn't exist. It has to, because you appeal to it all the time in order to differentiate between unicorns and science, the conceptual, empirical, and metaphysical claims that you have in your philosophy. Um, so I think existence is just simply fundamental. You have to assume that there's some sense to be made of it. It's not just a term, not just a meaningless term. Because you can say I exist
Well,
in a very
there's
meaningful way.
there's
It,
there's the
it makes
problem
it
when
makes
you
a very
say
important ontological claim too. When I
when you
say I
say
exist, I am ontologically differentiating myself from a unicorn.
when you say existence is fundamental, that is false. We know that there is a
Mm-hmm.
thing that is existence. We don't know if that's fundamental. So if I say a solid is fundamental and I hold up a cup, clearly this is solid because I can touch it. Well, no, it's solid isn't fundamental because we know it's not solid. It's just a combination of more fundamental things we just haven't discovered yet. So when we label things existence, that doesn't mean existence is fundamental. There could be something more fundamental than that, a different thing that we don't know about. So existence is a label we apply to things. It isn't a property of the universe. It's not a fundamental, by which I mean it's not fundamental. It's just an abstract concept. You can't say that there is this abstract concept and therefore it's fundamental. We can because those two are contradictory terms. It's a category error because we're taking the concept in our head and then take that and then describe that thing as being fundamentally an ontology about something in reality. And that you can't do. In order to go from the concept in our head to something that exists in reality, you need to demonstrate that it's not just imaginary, and that's what science does. And so that's my main objection
You
to
need
your
to
statement.
demonstrate. So in order to demonstrate, so you have to say it has to demonstrate. You're assuming that existence is really important though. It's fundamental. Either something exists or it doesn't exist. That exhausts all possibilities there, right? Either something exists or it doesn't exist. So
Yes,
it
but
really
that tells
does,
us
existence really does describe all the
no.
fundamental aspects of reality. So no matter what, like if you say that there is something even more fundamental than existence, that's just existence. You're just appealing to something great, some other thing that exists. I don't like existence is just something that exists. Like whatever you take, whatever we discover or whatever, it's just going to be something that exists. There's no
Existence
way around
is a
that, or it doesn't
label.
exist.
Existence is a
Hmm.
label for things that exist. It isn't what existence is. It's the
Hmm.
confusing the
Well, I'm not
idea.
saying the label itself is what existence is. I'm simply saying that the label picks out what existence is, and we understand intuitively through common sense, or in our own experience, in fact, what existence is. Compared to say a unicorn, we know that in terms of the relating these two differences to these two different things together.
Again, these are related in
Um,
our head. These are only concepts. This
mhm,
is not. This does tells us
mhm.
nothing about ontology.
Not just the concept. So the concept is picking out something that really exists in the world, something that really is. So there is existence in the world,
You're right,
and
but
namely
it tells us nothing
myself.
about it. It tells us
Mhm,
nothing what that is. It doesn't tell us anything about that.
mhm.
We can
Well,
get
yeah,
no
but
knowledge of
okay.
that.
It does tell us something about something. I exist. That tells me that compared to existence, existence is something that actualizes being. And some compared to like unicorn, we know that existence is different from something like imaginary things. It does. We do know something about it, namely that it's not imaginary. It's something that exists externally to us, independent of our minds. That
No,
is
again,
something that we know
again, that's
existence
that's just the
has.
definition of existence. So we can grant things exist,
Mm-hmm.
and we use the word existence to describe the things that exist as opposed to the things that don't exist, like unicorns. But we say
Mm-hmm.
a chair exists. What does that mean? We get nothing.
Mm-hmm.
There's no ontology that we can describe about the chair just because we say it exists. It's super vague. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a label we apply to it. And then in order to define what it means to exist, well, then we have to say, well, we can test it, we can demonstrate it, we can show that it has these properties which are not just imaginary. The existence itself is just a label we apply to it. It doesn't mean anything other than not non-existence. So it's just definitional. But then if we want to say something about ontology, about reality, then you have to show it's not just imaginary. So you have to go beyond the label of just exist and demonstrate
Mm-hmm.
what it means to exist. And to do that,
Mm-hmm.
we use science. You can't just apply the word existence and then lead to an ontology from the definition. You have to actually go beyond that.
Well, how can you know how can science know how to prove existence if it doesn't know what existence is?
It
If it
doesn't.
doesn't
It
know
doesn't.
anything about
It doesn't prove
existence,
existence. Existence is just a
it doesn't
label.
prove
So
existence.
again, we say things
Mm-hmm.
exist, and then we say, well, what does it mean to exist? And then we start to
Mm-hmm.
say, well, it has this property, and we can demonstrate this property. And that's what it means to exist. That's
Mm-hmm.
what we mean when we use the word existence, is that it has these demonstrable properties. So
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't demonstrate existence. Existence is just a label.
It's a label that picks out the existence because like that's what science is doing when it's picking out these properties. It's picking out existing properties, right?
I'm not. I'm not
Whatever we
sure. I'm not
do.
sure why. I don't know what about my argument you're not getting here. So anytime you use
Mm-hmm.
the word existence, it's descriptive, not prescriptive. It's just saying we describe
Mm-hmm.
that this thing has certain properties, and we can
Mm-hmm.
define those properties with science, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
end of existence. Only that.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's see. Like, we take. I'm not saying that we can. I'm not saying anything where we can say more something more fundamental about existence necessarily. I'm saying that okay, yeah, maybe it might be a primitive. For example, we might say it's a primitive term in some way, and that it's taking a primitive feature of the world, and then that's it. We can't really kind of define existence in terms of something else more fundamental than existence. And I'm not saying anything like, to that extent. I'm simply saying, like, yeah, okay, so existence is something that our concepts really pick out in the world that exist those that exist, so therefore existence has so something has existence, namely me. I'm the something that has existence because I exist. So what's disputable about that? To say metaphysically there has to be something exist, like namely myself, as you acknowledge, because you agree with Descartes on this. So you think I therefore I think therefore I am. So existence, since I exist, therefore I have existence. Existence isn't something fake; it's real. Isn't
So
it just a
so
concept?
so like if I said logic, A equals A, the law of identity. Does
Hmm.
A exist?
Well, not in a general feature, no.
Exactly. That's exactly
Hmm.
what I'm saying. Existence is the same
Hmm.
thing as A. It's a label
Hmm.
we apply generally to describe things, but it isn't the thing
Hmm.
itself. We can't just say, well, because A
Right.
can be used to describe everything, therefore A exists. That doesn't make any
Well, I'm
sense.
not saying okay. So I'm not saying existence itself exists. I'm not saying this bare general existence in its most at least not yet. At least my conclusion did, because that's what pure being is. But when we're starting off here, that's not what I'm saying. I'm simply something exists, therefore that thing has existence. So existence is in some sense real and that exists in a particular thing. Well, I'm not saying existence itself exists. I'm not saying the number A exists itself. But we are saying, for example, like you say about laws of logic, it does describe reality. It does something in the sense in which it is a real aspect of reality. Not that the law of logic itself in its abstract form exists as a concrete thing, but it really does describe an actual, the physical processes, the way the physical world actually is. So in a similar sense, when we're saying about existence, we're simply describing something the way the world actually is. We're saying that this thing exists, that thing has existence, that thing has existence. These things share these common features that they namely exist, unlike, say, unicorns. Matter, energy, you, cat, these are all existing things. They're all under this category of existing things. And the only reason we can say that through common sense is because existence is a real thing, not like by itself, but it exists as a particular thing. All existence is always going to exist as a particular thing. So I'm not saying that existence itself in general is something that exists yet. I haven't made that claim at this stage of the argument. Maybe that helps clarify things, I hope. But
So I mean, I agree that we use the term existence for things, and we differentiate existing things from non-existing things. So if we're just,
mm-hmm.
but okay, so that's just a label. So how do you go from that label to
Mm-hmm.
existence as a thing? That's the part I'm
Mm-hmm.
objecting to. I agree with the label. How do you go from existence as a label to existence as a thing?
So I'm not saying existence by itself is a thing at this point right now. So at this stage of the argument, I'm simply saying there's a thing that exists. That thing has existence. So existence is something that a thing has. It's not something that I'm not saying existence itself is by
Wait.
itself a thing.
How can it have existence and existence not be a thing?
So by itself, existence, it's something to some extent you have to have essences, right? And that's where this also comes in. But I'm not saying that there is this abstract feature, this existence in general yet. Not yet, anyways. I'm not saying that there's something that exists in general that is, just out there in some ethereal world and somehow it just comes down to the world. I'm saying existence exists in concrete things only right now. It's the only
Wait,
thing I'm saying. It exists in concrete things.
how can existence exist in concrete things if existence doesn't exist? How can something have existence? Because as far as I can tell,
You have existence. You have
existence isn't a
existence, right?
property. Existence is a
You have
description.
existence, though. You have existence.
How do I have
You
existence?
exist. You exist, so therefore you have existence.
So this is the part I want to understand. It's like
Mm-hmm.
existence isn't a property. It's not a predicate. Something can't have existence. It's just a description of something that does exist. Description, not prescriptive. So how can something have existence? What does that mean to have existence?
I mean, to have existence is unlike something like a unicorn doesn't have existence, for example. I mean, to have existence is simply to be in the world, to be in reality. That is what existence is. To be a real thing.
Well, it doesn't. Nothing in reality has resistance. Has existence. It's not like it's not a property of something. I don't understand what you mean by
You don't
has
necessarily,
existence.
okay. I mean, you don't necessarily have to understand it as a property, but I guess I kind of do it in some way too. But it's not. I don't even say it's a property because that's non-Thomistic terminology. But
Well, I mean, are you
existence.
familiar with the
Mhm.
criticism that existence isn't a predicate?
Yeah, I know from Kant. Right. Yeah. So I kind of just think that that's just clearly like, things do exist. That's the real property. This thing exists. You exist compared to a unicorn. What is that we're saying about the thing then? If we're not saying anything about that thing, what are we saying when you say that that thing exists and I exist? There's no differentiation between the
No,
unicorn
it does. It
and
does.
me then,
It's like
because
there's a
mm,
difference between describing something and saying it
hmm
has a property. Like I can
so how,
describe something as being up, but up isn't a property. It's not a property of the thing
hmm
that is going up. It's just a
hmm
description. So,
hmm
so in the same case, existence is just a description of it doing something, as opposed to not doing something, or not existing in this case. But it doesn't mean it has the property of existence, just like the object doesn't have the property of up. So that's what
hmm
this is. I'm really interested in this
yeah,
because I agree that existence isn't a predicate. It's a
hmm
description. So
hmm
when you say that something exists, you're not saying it has the property of existence. You're saying we're describing it has certain properties that, and existence isn't one of them.
hmm Well, okay, so let me trace back what you were saying there. Okay. Um, like say, I'm trying to remember what you said just earlier. Sorry, I just kind of like just had a brain fart here. Um, okay. So when I say something exists, like you're saying descriptions, for example, going back to descriptions. Okay. So you're saying descriptions, but in order to have describe anything, it has to exist first, because unlike the tallness or unlike, up and down, those are relative terms. Well, descriptions of anything is you're gonna have to fundamentally talk about something at rock bottom that just exists. It's not just a relative term. Well, we can say it exists in some way, but then it doesn't really exist. Like we can with tallness or whatever. You can say, yeah, I mean, you might be tall relative to this, but that doesn't really mean anything. Like relative to something else that you're not actually tall. Relative to like a huge tree, like the square trees, you're not really tall. That changes. But the existence is not something that changes in that way. It's not like relative to you existence now, and this has existence. Now all of a sudden, relative to this other thing, it does not have existence. It seems to be not make any sense. So it's not a descriptive term. It's more of an absolute term when we're talking about existence. Either a thing exists or it does not. It's an absolute thing. So we're not it just seems to me that you can't relativize it in the way that you're trying to relativize it.
Well, I'm not trying to relativize it. It's just an analogy to
Mm-hmm.
the difference between
Right, but those
descriptions.
are relational properties. So you're saying tallness, up and down. Those are all relative properties.
Well, not
So
the
they
relative
can
part. The
change.
relative part isn't the objection here. It's the difference between a
Mm-hmm.
description and a property. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, I can describe something as having a mass or whatever, and we just call
Mm-hmm.
it, say that's an absolute. It's not relative, but it's a description to say um, the object has mass.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how do I go from the description to it actually being a property? How do I know it's a property? Or if I to use the phlogiston example, so I have the object has phlogiston. I say it
Mm-hmm.
has the property of phlogiston. How do I like demonstrate that? How do I show that this is a real property?
Mm-hmm. So it depends on what phlogiston is, then I suppose. Then like, how are you defining that necessarily? Are you defining like maybe say a positive charge? You're saying that it's of this particular nature, has this particular property when it encounters some other object.
Let me be more
Like, what are you
specific.
saying?
How do you
Mm-hmm.
differentiate between a description and a property?
Mm-hmm. So descriptions are properties of something in some sense. Like if you're talking about like, you're talking about a property of object, how it reacts, you're saying, okay, it reacts in this certain way, it has a negative charge against this particular electron. So these interact in such a way that we're describing certain properties of the object itself. Descriptions are by properties. All descriptions are properties.
Well, no, remember because I used the example of up. Up is a
Mm-hmm.
description, but it's not a property.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well,
so
it's a relative property. So relative property. So there's absolute properties and relative properties. So like I'm talking about like absolute properties though in particular right now. So I'm talking about existence and just like mass. So something has a mass like that is you're differentiating in terms of its being. You have to like mass in terms and energy. They're distinct, but how? They're
so
distinct in terms.
so
You're describing certain things about the aspect of its being.
you said
So for
every description is a property.
I mean, every description has a property of some sort. You're describing something. It's like you're saying, okay, this thing can interact in this particular way. This thing interacts in that particular way. So those are features of the world. You're describing certain things that those have in their natures. Now, I guess for Aquinas too, maybe to make this spell it out more clearly, for us, operation follows being. So the activity of something is going to reflect its being in some sense. So we believe that because it's just like, well, we can't have any activity without anything to underlie that. If you're not a thinking thing, for example, you can say I'm thinking at that point, but what is doing the thinking? It's that underlying thing. It's you. You're the one doing the thinking. So that's what I'm saying is that we need to have these absolute properties to describe the way things are. Otherwise, if they're not, then we can't describe anything.
So, so I'm still stuck on this. All descriptions are properties. So because there's infinitely many ways
Mm-hmm.
we can describe anything, and they're all mutually contradictory. So I don't
Mm-hmm.
understand how a description could be a property, especially if it can have contradictory descriptions.
So you can you describe yourself as a non-thinking thing?
Yes.
You can. So if are you essentially a non-thinking? Is that what it is? Because
I mean,
you believe that you are a thinking thing, right? So that doesn't. Can you actually simultaneously and just as validly hold that you're a thinking thing, and then also not that you're not a thinking thing?
no, I can't think that, but I can
Okay,
describe myself in that way. I can give a description of myself in that way.
but it
But
wouldn't be coherent. That would be a meaningless description. That would not. I'm not talking about meaningless descriptions or
well, like
contradictory descriptions. I'm
so.
talking about meaningful descriptions. Like this has this positive charge. It's not this charge and this charge at the same time. And we're not saying it has this charge and it doesn't have this charge.
No, sorry, I understand that there's things have
Mm-hmm.
properties, and the properties can't be
Mm-hmm.
self-contradictory. But descriptions aren't properties. This is. I'm trying to make a distinction between descriptions and properties because we can
Mm-hmm.
describe something as a square circle. Those are both descriptions. It's a square and it's a circle. But so
Right, but
how
they're
how
meaningless, incoherent. Okay.
Well, I mean, the point is that we can give descriptions of lots of things.
Hmm.
I can describe the morning star and the evening star as two
Hmm.
separate things. That's two different descriptions. And now if those two
Hmm.
descriptions are themselves properties, then there's a problem because those are the same object. So if descriptions
Hmm.
are properties, that leads to contradictions. So descriptions can't be properties.
Okay, well, that's what I'm saying, though. There's a distinction between absolute properties and relative properties. So we're talking about morning star, evening star. That's a relational property. It's a difference in how it relates to us, whether it presents itself to us and it is as the evening star, or it presents itself to us as the morning star. But that's what I'm saying. But when we're talking about more fundamentally, is what I'm trying to focus on is the absolute properties. So when you're describing something, you're going to describe it either in terms of its relational properties, or you're going to describe it in terms of absolute properties. You have to. That's what all descriptions have to do, in some sense. If you're really going to be describing any real thing and it making any kind of coherent sense, you're going to have to making some description about how those things actually are in some way. So I don't know, maybe I'm
Well, I
confusing
can
in some
say
way.
I can describe ways it's not. I can describe
Right.
things we don't know about. I don't know this about something. We don't know what dark matter is. That's a description. But it doesn't,
Well,
it's
that's a
not a
description of
property.
your mental state. That's a description of your
Right,
mental state. I don't
right.
know.
But
Hmm.
but that's the thing is that we can describe things in terms of our mental states, which isn't a property of the thing. The description isn't a property of the thing.
Well, we can say that you are ignorant. That's like you are ignorant of this particular, fact about the world.
Well, right, but
So in
I
some
can
sense, that is
so
like okay. If you're talking about,
my
yeah, go ahead.
example is that we can describe things in terms of
Hmm.
other things that have nothing to do with them. So the descriptions aren't properties of the thing. It's not a property. Like it's descriptions are
Hmm.
ideas. They're
Hmm.
things in our head. They don't exist in the world. So if we're giving something a description, it's not a property of the thing. It's a property of our mind in some sense. Everything is because of how we think. But we can't conflate the descriptions and properties. Those are not the same thing. There's no connection between those two things. One is imaginary
Right.
and one is real. And you have to differentiate
Hmm.
between those two. You can't just call them the same thing.
So imaginary and real, that's a description itself, right? You're saying this is imaginary and that's real. So, but it's more than just a description because you're saying like, yeah, description. You're saying something in order for something to be real. It just seems to have to be a feature of that thing. So when I'm saying, for example, that you're ignorant of fact A, that is a feature of you. You are ignorant of that. And so when I'm saying something to the effect that okay, that thing exists, we're saying that that has a feature of existence in the matter. Matter has a feature of existence. So this mass, you have a feature of existence. So there has to be existence. Like it's an absolute property. If you can, then if it doesn't have existence, then you're describing nothing. You're describing just imaginary things, which is unicorns, matter, and energy. They're all equal in this case. In that case,
So
I just don't.
so a property is something that's owned. It is something entailed within the thing. But descriptions aren't. You can describe things in any way you want. They can be coherent or incoherent or accurate or inaccurate. They can be
Hmm.
contradictory. Descriptions have no connection to the properties of the thing. They're completely
Okay.
separate. I can describe a
Hmm.
square as a circle. That's a circle.
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
but it's not. So the description it doesn't convey any property there's an actual unless the description corresponds to reality. You have to show the description corresponds to reality. Then it can
Hmm.
be described as a property because it has a property that it's referring to. But the description itself isn't a property because it can be wrong. So the descriptions aren't properties unless the descriptions are true. If the description is true and it represents corresponds to reality, then it's a property because it corresponds to reality. The propertiness is does it correspond to reality? But the description isn't. That's something different. Those are not the
Hmm.
same thing.
Yeah, I'm not equating description. I'm not saying all descriptions are necessarily true by de facto. So I think you're using. I can see what you're doing. Okay, I think you're using. Um,
Well,
You're using
you
description
said
in a much more
all
broader sense. So
you,
you're using much in a much more broader sense to encompass even false descriptions. So I think that's what you're trying to say. Okay, false descriptions. Well, I'm just trying to focus on if you're going to make any true description is going to have to make something of some kind of like property about the world, and it's more general because I guess where the confusion lies is perhaps I'm using both relative properties to refer to description, and you're usually saying something, usually referring to descriptions to only refer to maybe those absolute properties, those things that the thing itself owns in its own intrinsic nature, right? Maybe something to that extent you might be using, saying that, okay, that's what properties are. It's with something that has of its own intrinsic nature, but descriptions don't necessarily have that. So like, for example, you can describe, right now I see a cloudy sky right now. Now I'm relating to it in a certain way, but it would make no sense to say, oh, I have a property of a cloudy sky. It wouldn't make sense. So maybe you're saying in that sense, well, we're just describing a situation, a state of affairs. And so those state of affairs aren't necessarily properties to me. And I can see that, but I'm saying that how I'm using that, those are relational properties though. So I'm kind of putting them both. Like we have absolute properties and relational properties. So when I'm seeing this sky here, so it's relating to me in a certain way, and it's presenting itself in a certain way to me. So there are real aspects of its being. So the cloud is presenting some way of itself to me, and I'm observing and perceiving in this particular way. So we're having this relational description here. It's not just a description. It's saying something about how we're affecting each other as being, our ontology. Our ontology necessarily has to be affected by it. So in order for there to be any descriptions at all, any valid description, any true descriptions anyways, they have to describe something in reality itself, some being. You're describing some being either in a relational way or you're describing it in an absolute way.
So I was going back to when you said all descriptions have properties, and that's the part where I was objecting to. You can definitely have descriptions that have no properties at all. That thing, that square is a circle is a description, but it's not a property because it's false. It could only be a property if it's true. And what you just said, I can give a description of something, like there is a unicorn, or I see a unicorn, which I don't see a unicorn. It's false. So there's no ontology labeled in there at all. That has nothing to do with ontology. It's because it's false. So
Okay, so maybe that was my bad because I meant true descriptions. I wasn't just referring to, I guess, descriptions in general. Maybe that's where the confusion going. In my head, I was just thinking of those two descriptions that we're talking about in science. So maybe that could help clarify.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so from my perspective, so there are descriptions that can be true and there are descriptions that can be false. So when we describe something as having the property of existence, how do you demonstrate that's one of the true ones and not one of the false ones?
Right. So I'd agree with you on science. We definitely use science to determine whether something is in fact a true property of that object. Or observation, typically, like say, does a cat meow? Is it capable of meowing? Well, yeah, I observe it. It's meowing right here. I can hear it. I can see it. So we see it often enough to then be able to verify that. And that's actual property of a meow. I mean, not a meow, of a cat. It can actually release meows. It can meow. So we're saying something real about its being. So in a similar way, if I can verify, for example, like say some undiscovered particle, and I can say, okay, so if that undiscovered particle is real, I can make predictions, and I will be able to observe it, and then it'll confirm itself, and that's therefore real. So yeah, then it'll confirm itself, and it's like, okay, this thing exists. This thing has existence. It has a property of existence. And so that's how I'd confirm it, just like you would. And so we're saying things about the reality of the thing itself.
Right. So exactly. So if you're saying there is this God, which is the pure existence, and in order to show something that exists is real and not imaginary, you have to demonstrate it. How do you get to the God thing?
Yeah, so that's the whole point of the argument was to show first we have to realize, okay, there are these things. Being is real insofar as there are things in the world, concrete things that have being. There are concrete things that basically have existence, but it's not sufficient enough because we see these certain processes. We see the process of change in the world, where it's like we don't see change itself. We're not seeing that some abstract concept of change and falling down from heaven or something, in Plato's heaven. We don't see anything like that, but we're seeing particular changes. This particular concrete change, that particular concrete change. And so therefore we're trying to say, okay, so what are the very preconditions, the metaphysical preconditions for change? Well, first there has to be something. Something has to exist. There has to be something in existence. Whether it's like the cat on the mat or something like I'm existing. There has to be some existing thing. So that's a clear precondition of the possibility of change. Not only that, but there's the ways that thing actually is in a particular way. So it's like, there's not just being in general, but I'm a being of a certain sort. I have a being that thinks. I'm a being that walks. I'm a being that thinks, that talks. Unlike, say, a cat, which is a being of a different sort, which has certain actualities, such as it walks on 4 legs and it has fur and all these different other properties that it has. So there are different ways in which it actually is. So these are real features that I'm picking out in the world when I'm talking about this. And so then we say, okay, so then we have the way something actually is. and we know that change occurs. We see it and observe it. It's confirmed through empirically, through it's common and evident to the senses. I mean, okay, well, now we know that the first precondition is that it has to be being, but being is not sufficient for change, because change involves changing from something that does not yet exist, right? So that red rubber ball is changed into something that does not yet exist, which is an orange rubber ball. So where does that come from, though? That orange rubber ball is non-being. It doesn't exist yet. There's nothing that doesn't exist. We can confirm that empirically. So to account for why that change occurs, we have to introduce these potencies, potentials, that there's a real potential in the ball to become orange. It's not just that the being is coming into non-being, because that would mean something coming from nothing, and that's impossible. Nothing has no causal power to give. It has no ability to affect anything. So it can't just be that orangeness comes out from thin air, out of non-being, and then comes into the ball. It has to be such that what Aquinas is saying, what Aristotle was saying, that it's moving from one type of being to another type of being, where that being of potentiality is being actualized by something that is actual, which is fire. That's what change involves in. Change is the actualization of a potential.
Well,
Something making something
let me
actual.
jump in. So let me put it this way. If I want
Okay.
to say, we can just keep all the terminology, the Thomistic terminology, and just say the pure essence of reality is just a natural, undiscovered thing. It's a natural law. There's no need for a conscious being at all. We can just say the terminology is vague enough that it can apply to whatever the fundamental nature of reality is, and the fundamental nature of reality is naturalistic pantheism, just an eternal, all powerful nature thing. So it doesn't seem to be anything that would. How would that contradict with Thomism? How would that not be explainable or accurate?
I mean, okay, that's a start at least. Now we do. At least you can see it. There has to be some unmoved mover, something that just simply has change. I mean, has pure actuality without itself being changing something else, right? So that's what you're proposing. And maybe pantheism, naturalistic pantheism, maybe that is what is purely actual. Is that what you're saying? Am I understanding you correctly there? Or
Well, I'm saying I don't technically agree with your terms, but I can see we can
mm,
just apply them to whatever the fundamental nature of reality is. So I can say
mm-hmm,
whatever the fundamental nature of reality is, no matter what it is, we can just take all of your terminology and apply it to that no matter what.
mm-hmm,
To me, it seems your terminology is so vague it can apply to anything. So if I
mm-hmm.
want to say whatever the fundamental nature of reality is, we can just call that pure actuality.
Okay.
And here I can call the nature of part of nature pure actuality.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the very nature of metaphysics is it's general. That's because you said about you're critiquing it in terms of vagueness, and just want to make sure that metaphysics is very well notorious for focusing on just those general aspects of reality, those aspects of reality that any possible reality must have. It's David Lewis we're talking about. All these people are focusing on very general, broad notions of being. Um, and so when I'm saying this, Scott, like, at least Thomism is not any different from all these other metaphysics. So they're both kind of like all these other metaphysics describing certain things in general ways, and we're trying to account for reality and what makes reality possible in the first place. So, question then, um, I would say in terms of like this naturalistic pantheism, what it does is that it rules out, because if we define matter in a very particular way, which I do, and most Thomists do as well, is that matter is made of actin potencies. It's actin potency. It's matter and form. It's a very concrete, particular thing, and so it can't be material, like I was saying. It can't be some material thing that moves around in space, because then it's changing. It can have like some kind of finite, definite quantities that some kind of science can discover. Like that's also limits finite. So if it's going to be purely actual, it's going to be pure being. It's going to have to be immaterial. It's going to have to be eternal, and so that I kind of think it rules out naturalistic pantheism in a sense. But I guess you want to say pantheism in a non-physicalist sense. So
Well,
you
no,
probably
no, no,
want
not necessarily. So
to. Mm-hmm,
your what your claims about matter seem to be just assumptions. You've defined matter to be
mm-hmm.
this way, but you can't just define matter to be that way.
Well, they're not assumptions, but I mean, there's a lot of thought that's went into this, but it's just that I haven't really. There's a lot of arguments to kind of pull through into
Right. So,
debate.
so I'm saying
Uh-huh.
that you can't use arguments to categorize matter. You can only use them to
Mm-hmm,
categorize the known kind of matter. So there could
mm-hmm,
always be more kinds of matter or more kinds of natural or more kinds of physical that have new properties we haven't discovered yet. So you
mm-hmm,
can't limit the natural or the material or anything by what we currently know and then extrapolate that to mean all possible matter must have this same limitation. That would be a composition
mm-hmm.
division fallacy. So go ahead.
Oh no. Okay, so I would definitely disagree with that in some sense, because when we're talking about all matter, we're talking about like what does it mean to be a material thing? Is it going to be I mean, if you're gonna introduce some other kind of thing, it's like some maybe some immaterial object, like something that doesn't have any particular form, has no nature. It's not like a particle in space or time, and it's not even quantifiable. Even if you want to like you even remove quantification, you want to move extension from matter, from the very notion of matter. You're just simply now saying something that's going to be immaterial by definition. It's going to be something that just is not a material thing. It defies any notion of materiality because it can't be quantifiable. If it doesn't have any concrete form or definite nature of some sort, you're not talking about matter at this point. You might probably be just talking about material things like abstract concepts. You're talking about universals. You're talking about something completely different then at this point.
Well, no, because matter.
Where you're call. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Remember, in science doesn't give a concrete definition of matter. It just gives we're going to call matter these properties we can demonstrate, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have a concrete definition of matter at all. We're just saying we can demonstrate these properties. We're going to call that matter, and if we can demonstrate more properties, we call that matter too. So the quantifiable thing, well, we can quantify anything. There is one God that I've just quantified God. So quantification, because numbers are abstract, can apply to anything, real or not real. They don't. It doesn't. It wouldn't. It's again, it's a descriptive, not a property. So the fact that we can quantify something isn't a property; it's a descriptive thing. And so that wouldn't limit it from being the pure essence, because I could say there is one God. I just quantified God. So I don't see how that argument relates to or excludes matter either. So the first objection is that matter isn't defined concretely. It's just this is the things we can demonstrate so far, and there could always be more. And the second one is that the quantifiability isn't an objection because you can quantify anything. It's just numbers are descriptive, not properties.
Okay, so in response to that, I think that science is the very principles, the very methodology of science is limited to what is quantifiable, to what is observable, to what is predictable. So you can't simply say, okay, whatever doesn't have any of those things, science can discover it, because by definition, science limits those things itself to those things. Its very principles is founded on just like, predictions, predictive powers, quantifiable quantification, something that it can quantify, something that it could, some sense, test, either empirically, whether directly or indirectly. Those are the things that science limits itself in. So if you want to say, well, there might be something else that does not fit into that notion of matter, then it's like, well, how is science going to discover that in the first place? It's kind of like saying a metal detector, saying how you can detect all these metals and stuff. Well, this metal detector is going to detect something that does not have metal in it.
Well, let me answer
one day
that.
we're going to see something.
So
we're going to see something. So science, okay.
Well, it's because you asked, well, how are we? Science, all science is a way to differentiate the imaginary from the real, and testable, verifiable, quantifiable ways are just how we do that. It doesn't mean it's the only way to do
exactly.
that. So there could be
but
more
it's the
ways.
way in which
There could be more ways that we haven't discovered yet that science can actually differentiate the imaginary and the real for non-quantifiable things.
But it wouldn't be science it wouldn't be science in any particular sense. It'd probably be metaphysics at that point. What you're trying to say?
Yeah, it could be.
We'd
That'd be
metaphysics.
totally fine, but that wouldn't be.
And that's not necessarily
science.
science at that, because we're talking about completely different methods. If there's a way of knowing something without being able to test it, without being able to verify through through predictions or quantify it, those are all features of material things. It describes something about the material things, anyways. And if it goes out of that purview of science, you're talking about something different. You're talking about different fields. I'm fine with this. Is like metaphysics.
Science is just how we differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real. That's it. That's all science is.
And it does so through testing. It does through
correct.
Okay, if you're talking about if you want to talk about science in a broad sense, yeah, because Aquinas defines science in a very broad sense. He said metaphysics is a type of science because it's in fact describing something about the reality, and we're proving it through reason itself. Rather than simply saying it's testable, we're proving through deductive necessity about the nature of things. That's how we come to know something. We're taking these general features of the world and we're saying, okay, this is what the world must be. Similar to how, like, for example, scientists do this to a lesser degree. When they say, for example, take a hamster. Now, scientists don't study any particular hamster in general. Like my hamster used to be named Luffy. And they don't just study, okay, Luffy is the hamster we're studying. And then when Luffy dies, okay, there's no more study of hamsters anymore. No, it's not. Like, they're not studying Luffy just for Luffy's own sake. They're studying hamsters in general. They're trying to get at the general nature of hamsters. So they study multiple hamsters, and they're saying, okay, these are the features that hamsters have in general. These are the qualities that they have in general. These are actually real features of its being. When they were just kind of like generalizing it to this description. And so in a similar way, what metaphysics does is this in a more higher sense, in a far more general sense. It's taking the most general features of the world, which is being, non-being, relational properties, absolute properties, then coming to infer that Okay, so this being this be of this particular sort has to, and what makes change possible, for example, is that it has to have act and potency. So we're like those are real discoveries, and we're discovering through we start off with empirical means. We say, okay,
I think
okay,
you've
this is
lost me a
change
little bit.
exists.
I think you've lost me.
Okay.
So my argument
Mm-hmm.
was that science is just anything we can use to differentiate between imagination and reality. Our current
Mm-hmm.
methods are testable, verifiable, quantifiable, but
Mm-hmm.
those aren't exhaustive. Those aren't all things science could
But
be
I'm saying under
satisfied.
that definition, metaphysics would be included in.
Right.
Because
So
if metaphysics can demonstrate that, which I think it has to some extent, even you think that in terms of I think therefore I am, you think it has demonstrated that, something that science itself cannot demonstrate to its methodologies, because it's something that's self-evident to us. Um, that is a way, a means of proving. So metaphysics has proven things, but like if you want to conflate metaphysics with science, then I guess you could, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the material thing anymore. We're talking about metaphysical things now.
right. So science doesn't limit
Mm-hmm.
itself to material things. Science doesn't
Mm-hmm.
care. If there was a way to demonstrate immaterial things were real and not imaginary, science would adopt that methodology. So science doesn't care about material things. Those are just the things we happen to be able to demonstrate are not imaginary, and we label those as material. So, so I don't. Your two objections were
Mm-hmm.
one was things are quantifiable,
Mm-hmm.
and you're in, you're saying that things that are quantifiable can't be fundamental. So I can prove that wrong
Mm-hmm.
by saying there is one God. So if I grant
Mm-hmm.
everything about you're saying there is a God, I just quantified God. So
Mm-hmm.
if what you were saying is true, then that would refute your God.
Well, I'm not saying in that sense. I'm saying, for example, when it quantification, yes, you can limit God to just one. What I'm saying when in terms of quantification is that it has finitude. It has some limitation of its being. That's what I'm referring to. It has certain properties that it's not like unlimited properties, and like it has all the unlimited properties in some sense. It can be described in a quantifiable sense. Anyway, although you can say something about God and saying that He is one, you're not saying that okay, God has this mathematical process or this kind of equation. He can be put into this equation necessarily. We're just that those are things that is necessarily like inherently scientific. But I think your view of science is pretty, I don't know, it's abnormal to me from what I'm used to. Most people are going to be saying that, at least scientists and philosophers of science, they're usually going to say something to the effect, it's not just like science is a study of everything, or including even metaphysics, even some non-quantifiable thing. Science is usually limited, strictly speaking, to the empirical, to the testable, to something that can be quantified out. All those things, it's talking about something that's material. But if you want to include that in science, I guess you could. It's just that, well, that's just metaphysics at this point. What you're calling science is just metaphysics when we're doing some
Uh,
other thing.
Sort of, but not really. So most of the scientists I
Mm-hmm.
talk to do actually agree with this definition, but most scientists and don't think that metaphysics can be demonstrated to not be imaginary. So that's the reason it doesn't fit into the
Mm-hmm.
category is because there's no way to demonstrate it's not imaginary, and so that's why it's not a science. So, but most scientists do agree with that definition in general. So I
So
don't,
they agree that science can study immaterial things if it if
yeah,
it existed, that is.
yeah, science. If there is a way to demonstrate it, then yeah, everyone scientists would be okay with that. They don't care. Like,
Way to demonstrate it, but the way to demonstrate it would be through empirical means, right? So science limits itself to the
no.
empirical.
Again, so that's
Mm-hmm.
only the way we have now. Like science is
Okay.
anything we can do to differentiate our imagination from reality. So if there is a way to demonstrate, or if there is a way to show that non-physical things are not imaginary, scientists would adopt it immediately. And scientists don't have a
Mm-hmm.
problem with that at all. So the
Okay.
reason we use testable, verifiable means is because that's the way we have that we know we can differentiate imaginary from reality, and that's why science uses it is because that's the way we know that works. We don't have another way yet. So scientists have no problem studying the immaterial if we had a way to show it wasn't imaginary. We just don't, as far as we know.
Yeah, we don't have an empirical means, and that's by definition it's impossible to study empirically the material. So it'd have to be a different method. So
Well,
your
no,
definition of
no.
science is very fluid. It
Well,
seems
no.
it's
So,
like,
so we
mm-hmm,
can actually study the immaterial using empirical methods. Like, for example, if I said there's
mm-hmm,
an immaterial being named Bob, and every time I ask Bob for a gold brick, he materializes a gold brick in front of me, and that happens, then that would be evidence of
mm.
the immaterial Bob. So we can actually investigate the immaterial using material means. But so I don't
I
understand your
mean, I
objection.
don't see why we couldn't just say what. Yeah, I mean, I don't understand why you couldn't just say like, oh, okay, there's some cosmic physicalist being, some physical being that's doing it, that's causing that. Like, I don't see how science would necessarily be able to say, verify that it is an immaterial cause by itself. You'd have to introduce some metaphysical introduction presuppositions as well,
Well,
it seems.
well, not necessarily, because you could just say there's an immaterial
Hmm.
thing, and the immaterial thing is a product of some other thing we just don't know about yet. So it wouldn't necessarily be a
Hmm.
metaphysical thing about the fundamental nature of reality. But the reason that would be evidence of the non-physical is because anything that can, we know that novel testable predictions can demonstrate something is real and not imaginary. So if we can make novel testable predictions about immaterial things and they are correct, then that's evidence that
Hmm.
those things are real and not imaginary, regardless of whether or not they're
Hmm.
physical. So
Okay,
science
but
doesn't have a problem there.
so you wouldn't limit, but you already said yourself that you wouldn't limit science to just what is predictable or testable, right? There might be some other science later, you're saying,
All
that
right,
could be completely different, right?
right. So
Okay.
the methods we have now are the testable, predictable, and if we could
Mm-hmm.
make testable, predictable things about the immaterial, that would be evidence of the immaterial.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I just think that's okay. I feel like a naturalist could always just say, well, look, if I start off with just saying that, okay, well, we got to start with what we know, and we don't have any experiences of these immaterial beings. We only have experiences of naturalistic beings. So using the means of induction, it's probably whatever the case is about that brick. We can explain that then through some naturalistic means. We don't need to appeal to an immaterial being. But I do get what you're saying to some extent because I do agree to some extent that the empirical justifies God's existence ultimately. Because for Thomists like me, we try to ground our system not just in abstraction. We start with the concrete world, then we extrapolate certain features of that concrete world, like I told you, change, acting potency. Those are real features of the world. Then we get to the more general sense, and then we argue for God's existence from there. So there's a certain sense in which the empirical world is tied to the metaphysical world. So for Thomas, we don't like to detach that. We don't saying, oh, that the metaphysical world stands on its own and we can just project anything we want on the material world. Rather, the material world is the thing that which we derive our source content, and then we kind of extrapolate some metaphysical belief system from that. Um, so, so from what I'm saying here is that yeah, there's some sense in which the empirical then justify the immaterial, but not through the means that which you're using here, I guess. I'm using it through rational means, through rational extrapolations. We're kind of generalizing features. We're taking general features of the world, the most general features, which is being, non-being, and then we're trying to make an argument for God's existence from that. And that seems if that is valid to you, if that's something that you would call as science, then that's fine. I mean, that's just metaphysics then. But if you're saying like, okay, there's some other science that doesn't do what metaphysics does and does not do what this today's modern science does, I'm just like, okay, well, you have to kind of explain what that's going to be then, because all the tools of what we have available is going to be reason, it's going to be the empirical, the senses, and all those things, and the conceptual. Those are the things that you appeal to that we do have access to, and so they're the only means in which we can really talk about the world through our conceptual, empirical, and metaphysical senses.
Well, I wanted to object
So
to one thing you said there was that
okay.
yes, a naturalist could, anything we see, like if I said there is a supernatural being or a non-physical being and predicted it would make a gold brick and we see a gold brick, the naturalist
Mm-hmm.
could always explain that naturally. You can do that for
Mm-hmm.
anything. It's just called the problem of underdetermination. But that
Right.
doesn't stop it from being evidence of the supernatural. That would still be evidence of the supernatural. Just like in quantum physics, the first theory that predicted um, the quantum particle thing was Copenhagen interpretation. It says that quantum randomness is a fundamental part of reality itself, and that though that can make a prediction that certain interactions will happen in a delayed quantum erasure experiment. And
Mm-hmm.
most physicists did not like this. They think this was like magic or miracles. Randomness isn't a
Mm-hmm.
thing, all determinists. But because it made the predictions, it was accepted. Now, lots of other theories
Mm-hmm.
after that could explain it, like the de Broglie pilot wave theory, the many worlds, the multiverse. But none of those were
Right.
accepted because the one that made the prediction first is the one that's the most supported by evidence. So if you can say
Mm-hmm.
there is a non-physical being, and this non-physical being is going to generate a gold brick, and it happens regularly, it
Mm-hmm.
makes the novel testable predictions before anybody else can predict it, that is evidence of the non-physical being. There, we have
Mm-hmm.
reason to believe the non-physical being is the best explanation because it can make the predictions more faster than anybody else. It doesn't matter if you can
Mm-hmm.
post hoc explain it as a natural thing, because it made the testable
Mm-hmm.
predictions, it's got the best evidence. So naturalism
Mm-hmm.
does allow for non-physical things to be indicated by evidence in the same way physical things are indicated by evidence, or anything, or the bending of space-time is indicated by evidence, or quantum randomness is indicated by evidence. Just Any idea you
Hmm.
want, you can insert it in there, make a testable prediction, and if it works, then that's evidence for it. Science doesn't isn't limited to the material in that sense.
So if say I had a theory of thunder and lightning, for example, and I explained it in terms like say 2,000 years ago, I explained it in terms of Thor and some process, I don't know exactly, and I just explained it. And I was the first to come with it. And I was like, well, it has some predictive success in telling me like when lightning will occur, at this particular moment. So like, okay, Thor has this intention, combined with this observation of the sky, then we combine those intentions and it makes this prediction that it'll arrive there. That and it happens first. That just seems absurd. Just because it happens first does not mean it makes it more right. If anything, we'd want a feature. If some other explanation comes later, we'd say, okay, we'd favor the simpler explanation first off, and we'd say, well, we
No,
don't want something ad hoc. It just seems like the appeal to Thor. It seems to be like an ad hoc thing. It's like, okay, that doesn't really explain anything. It's just like it's an historical accident that the Copenhagen interpretation made those predictions first. Like
correct,
it's
it
just an
is,
historical
but
accident. So we shouldn't base our knowledge on what happens as a historical accident.
oh, we have to. It's just part of the problem of induction. But the first thing you said is
Mm-hmm.
we don't go off simplicity. Simplicity is a secondary property. Whichever comes first and makes the testable predictions wins, hands down, regardless of simplicity. The Copenhagen
Mm-hmm.
interpretation is not the simplest, but
Mm-hmm.
we accept it because it was first. So the fact that it was
Mm-hmm.
first supersedes its simplicity. And I'd say it also
Mm-hmm.
supersedes the ad hocness too, because I think just saying randomness is a part of the universe seems pretty ad hoc. I would qualify that as an ad hoc assumption. So the fact that it was
Okay.
first and makes predictions supersedes
Mm-hmm.
simplicity and ad hocness. Same with like time
Mm-hmm.
bending. I would say that
Mm-hmm.
Einstein calling time bending, I would say that qualifies as ad hoc. That's ridiculous.
Interesting.
But
Okay. Okay.
it
Yeah.
doesn't matter. It works, so we accept it. But anyway,
Okay.
we've been going for like 2 hours. It's been a great
Have we?
conversation.
It's two
Yeah,
hours?
yeah.
Wow. Wow, dude. Okay, you're a really interesting person to be, I gotta
Yeah,
say.
so are you. I mean, this was a great
So
conversation. I loved
yeah,
it. Oh,
I
but
really
one
appreciate
of one of
it.
the people in the comments had a question for you, if you don't mind. Uh,
Yeah, go ahead.
Cam Spears asked, "Does Gil think our metaphysics should follow our best physics as in be informed by and take as a starting point?"
I do think like we start as a starting point, we start with the empirical world. So as Thomists, we do start, and in some sense, we do take in consideration, especially what physics says. But there are some things like if, for example, if physics did say, for example, it's like made some kind of claim about a TV be both a TV and not a TV at the same time, and that's where we'd have problems. But in general, we do start with the natural world. That's what we call natural philosophy for Thomists. We always start with the natural world. Then we reason up to the metaphysical world, but we never start top down. We start from the down to top. So that's what I'd say.
Awesome. Well,
Mm-hmm.
it's been great
Yeah.
having you on. I have to go get ready to do
Likewise.
something. So
Okay. 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 Well, I appreciate you. Thank you so much,
yeah,
Tom.
absolutely. Thanks again for
All
coming on.
right.
It was a great
All right.
conversation. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah. You're awesome, man. All right. Take care.